You should be ready to go.
Thank you. Welcome. This is day 2 of the Select Committee on School Finance Recalibration, of the second of 3 days of hearings. My name is Dave Kinski. I'm in the State Senate, and I'm co-chairing the meeting along with Albert Summers of the House of Representatives. Albert chaired yesterday. I'll chair today. And I'll call the meeting to the order, and let's go ahead and get a roll call. Just make sure that we've got a quorum present.
All right. Senator Bebout.
Here.
Senator Coe.
Here.
Senator Hicks.
Here.
Senator Cost.
Here.
Senator Rothfuss.
Here.
Representative Barlow.
Here.
Representative Connolly.
Here.
Representative Harshman.
Here.
Representative Nicholas.
Here.
Representative Schwartz.
Here.
Co-chairman Summers.
Here.
Co-chairman Kinski.
Here.
We have a quorum.
Thank you very much. Yesterday was a very productive day. Today we've got a lot of ground to cover as well. And what I'd ask on comments or questions is, I think the practice that co-chairman Summers had was a good one, which is let's hold questions towards the end or an appropriate break point as determined by the consultants. So first up is going to be the K-12 salary study, and that's Christina Stoddard and then Pikus and Auden. I'm not sure who's going to lead off on that, but I'll turn it over to you folks to walk us through your presentation, and welcome.
This is Chris Stoddard. Larry or Alan, I don't know if you guys have comments you want to make before I start the presentation.
Good morning, Mr. Co-Chair, members of the committee. Good morning, everybody else. Chris, I'm happy to turn it over to you directly and leave you in charge this morning for now. So go right ahead, and we'll enjoy listening to what you have to say.
All right, Mr. Chairman, give me just a second here, and I think I need to have the screen sharing enabled for me.
Dr. Stoddard, I believe you have that capability.
Yep, now I do. So let me make sure I'm sharing the right thing here. Okay. All right, so Mr. Chairman and committee members, I'm really glad to be here. It's always weird presenting this way. So I am more than happy to take questions as we go throughout, because it's a little harder for me to gauge when people are confused or have a clarifying question, but certainly we can take kind of questions of substance all at the end. But again, I'm happy to take questions throughout. So I've divided my presentation into 2 parts here. So the first part focusing on teachers, and then I believe maybe we have a break and we'll talk about non-teaching positions next. So just a brief outline of what I'm going to go through here today. So I'm going to focus a little bit. This report goes a little bit more in depth into some areas, the teacher salary markets, than the usual monitoring reports. So I'll kind of highlight those differences for those of you that have been on committees that have seen similar work in the past. I'm going to spend less time talking about retirement and student enrollment, because those trends really have been pretty flat, pretty stable. So we'll start by looking at how teacher salaries compare with other professionals in Wyoming. Then we'll talk about how they compare with adjacent states. And then we'll try to look at some of the outcomes related to teacher salaries, specifically looking at retention and recruitment and training. And then at the end, I'll just summarize the findings briefly and present what I see as a set of potential recommendations or a framework for thinking about salaries in this recalibration. So as I'm sure many of you are aware, but just starting for context here, I'm just looking at kind of the trajectory of what has happened with teacher salaries over sort of this longer period. So going back to the first funding model, or the current funding model when it was put into place in its first iteration, there was this large increase, as many of you are aware, in teacher salaries back in 2004-05. And since then, so for a number of years, basically up until 2010, teaching salaries in the model continued to increase and then really flattened as external cost adjustments weren't applied for a number of years. And actual salaries, which are that dark line that you can see just above the model salaries, have continued to increase somewhat, although certainly at a much slower rate since 2010 than they'd had previously. So currently actual teacher salaries are about 10% above the model salaries. So actual salaries are $59,000 in the latest year that I'm working with here. Model salaries are $53,648. So like I said, there's about this 10% premium. So basically, I'm going to use those patterns. So look at that sharp rise in salaries up until 2004, then kind of the moderate rise, and then the much more modest increase since then, to kind of see what's been the effect of these teacher salaries over time. I just would emphasize, even though obviously your concern as a legislature is to figure out what model salaries should be, when we look at teacher recruitment, retention, teachers are responding to actual salaries. And so it's that pattern in actual salaries that that is relevant for, you know, a person considering teaching or a person considering staying or leaving and teaching. All right, so then to begin, how do teacher salaries in Wyoming compare with professional counterparts? And there are a couple of different counterparts that we can think of here. So the solid black line is looking at teacher salaries as reported in the Bureau of Labor Statistics Occupational Employment Statistics series. So that is a survey of employers, so not of individuals, and asking about salaries by occupation. And so that's a great data series for allowing us to compare teachers to other occupations within Wyoming. So there are two sets of professionals basically that I look at. So the top blue line with the X's there is the Bureau of Labor Statistics classification that are professional and technical occupations. And all of that is listed, I believe it's on page 28 in your report, the main occupational categories there that are included in that broader category of professional and technical occupations. So it's going to include most of the occupations that might be relevant for someone who's a college graduate. So it's going to include, you know, management occupations. It's going to include engineers. It's going to include healthcare practitioners. It obviously includes teachers. So when I'm calculating that average there, I'm excluding teachers from that. So that's that blue line. So who is not included in that would be agricultural workers, would be service workers, would be construction, or other kinds of trade professions. So like I said, when they say professional and technical, you know, they're thinking about occupational therapists and, you know, computer technicians. And so those kinds of fields are what they mean by technicians. So the comparable occupations, which is that red dotted line, come from a set of occupations that were defined by the Economic Policy Institute. And so what they did is they looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics scores different professions along a number of different dimensions. How much autonomy do you have? What kinds of skills are used in that profession? And they identified a set of occupations that they felt like were most comparable to teachers. It's a much, much smaller set. And those occupations are also listed, again, on page 28 of the companion report here. So for example, that in Wyoming, that's largely going to be dominated by accountants and nurses. So there are other professions in there, clergy and editors and things like that are going to be much smaller occupations in Wyoming. So I give you both of those. In the rest of this report, I'm largely focusing on the professional and technical occupations because it's a broader set, and it's the set that's most relevant, I think, to college graduates. So I think there was some correspondence between myself and one of the other committee members who was saying, it seems like accountants and engineers are a really good comparison for teachers. Accountants and engineers would both be in the professional and technical occupations. Accountants would be in the comparable ones, engineers would not. So that kind of gives you a sense of that. So at any rate, if we look at teaching wages and how they compare to these other workers, you can see that, prior to the big salary increase, there was, something of a gap between teachers and comparable occupations. And then teacher salaries rose to be quite close. So getting close to, 95%, in some cases, if we're looking at comparable occupations, even a little bit above the salaries of professionals in those other careers. And then since, about 2012 have lagged behind. So the growth in those other occupations has been faster, the salary growth. So right now, teachers are right now being May 2019, teachers make about 85% of what professional and technical workers make. They make about 88% of comparable occupations. So that, while that's not 100%, there's reason to think that it might not be 100%, that might not be the right market value. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in just a second here. But first, for context, in this graph, I've put in where the Wyoming model is. So again, the ratio now, so this is looking at that ratio of teacher salaries to professional and technical workers. You can see it rising up above 95% and then falling to its current level of about 85%. You can see the model, though, has fallen so that now I believe it's about 76%. The US ratio, you can see, is right around 77%. That's the red dotted line. And then the blue line down below is the average ratio in adjacent states, so states adjacent to Wyoming. And so you can see the model is right in the mix with those others, very close, so right about 75%. But it's definitely continued on this sort of falling trajectory. So what's the right ratio, right? So there, of course, that's a difficult question to answer. So there are a couple of ways that I approach this. So largely the way I've thought about it here is looking at hours and weeks of work. So how much do teachers work compared to other occupations? So there are different sources of data to answer that question. So one is looking at the American Community Survey, and that's not a survey of employers, that's a survey of individuals. So individuals report how much they work. So you have to trust, what they're saying. And in that survey, teachers report working on average 44 hours a week. If you look at a college-educated non-teacher, they report working 45 hours a week. So I said, that's pretty close. So hours of work per week are fairly similar. Where there's a much bigger difference is weeks of work. So the American Community Survey is difficult to use for weeks of work because a person who may report their main occupation as a teacher is reporting all of the weeks that they worked in a year. So if they have a summer job, or they worked summer school and got additional pay for that, or another worker, similarly might have two different jobs during a year, they're reporting all of those weeks of work. Most college educated workers in the American Community Survey report that they worked 52 weeks a year. So they're like, yeah, I worked the whole year. So they're obviously not counting vacation time in that. So instead, what I've done is looked at the Bureau of Labor Statistics has this national compensation survey. So again, this is a survey of employers, and they ask about a range of different kinds of benefits. And so they ask, one of the things they ask about is paid vacation days. And typically in the private sector, paid vacation days depend on the amount of work experience you have. So someone who's worked for 5 years on average has 15 days of paid vacation. If you've worked 20 years, it's up to 20 days of vacation. So basically, if you're looking at a private sector worker, they're working roughly 48 to 49 weeks per year. If we look back at teachers again, teachers in Wyoming have 185 contract days, so that would translate into 37 weeks per year. But many teachers work some during the summer to prepare their classes. So to try to get a sense of that, I go back to the American Community Survey and say, okay, let me throw out all the teachers who say that they worked 52 weeks a year, because either they're just saying, you know, I've got a full-time job, or they're working a second job. So of those who work less than that, the biggest cluster report working 40 weeks a year. So that's about a third of teachers who aren't saying I work full time. The rest of them are kind of all over the map. And so I'm taking that to mean, you know, if I'm a new teacher, if I'm a teacher who has preps, probably those people don't have a 3-week job. I mean, they could, you know, maybe they did something for 3 weeks during the summer, but probably those weeks of between 37 weeks and 40 weeks are weeks that they spent prepping. So I would say that the largest ratio then in terms of weeks of work would be if we're thinking about, say, new teachers who are doing a lot of prep, and we're thinking about a young private sector, or sorry, a more experienced private sector worker who has a lot of vacation days, if we compare those two. So a little bit of apples and oranges there. The biggest ratio you would get would be 83%. And conversely, if we say, okay, here's a more experienced teacher, they pretty much have it dialed in, they're working, you know, their contract days, the 37 weeks per year. If I compare that to a private industry worker that has 15 paid vacation days, then that would be a ratio of 76%. So, so I think a reasonable way to think about this is that kind of the right ratio, or a ratio that takes into account weeks of work, would be a ratio that lies between 76 and 83%. Whoops, let's see. So that is consistent with the kinds of ratios that we see. So again, here is the ratio in Wyoming. These are actual teacher salaries. If you recall, I told you that ratio right now is at 85%. And then what I've plotted here is the model ratio. So again, that's the dotted black line. And then all of these other lines show the ratio in neighboring states. So you can see that that ratio in neighboring states ranges between about 65% and 85% in Wyoming. You can see that the model is kind of right in the middle here, right in the mix of other states. And then I didn't put this in the report, but I just thought I'd present it just so you can kind of see all 50 states. Where do they look? So this graph, basically Vermont has the highest ratio, Arizona has the lowest ratio. And this bar graph kind of shows you how states sort of cluster up. So you can see Wyoming's here in red at that 85%. So Wyoming ranks 5th in the nation in terms of our ratio of teaching wages relative to the wages of other professional and technical workers. So you can see Vermont, Alaska, Oregon, and New York lying above Wyoming. I put in blue the adjacent states, so you can see they're sort of sprinkled around. And again, you can see that the biggest bars here sort of lie in that 75 to 85% range. Certainly there are a number of states that lie below that, but so the US average is pretty close to where South Carolina is. I put in the model ratio and the neighbor average. You know, they're all pretty close. So let me just pause and ask if there are questions about that, because I know that, you know, that's kind of a lot of numbers and information. So.
Co-Chairman Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. You may have to pop out from that screen so you can see people. Maybe you got two screens. I couldn't. But my question is, as we look at comparisons between Wyoming model salary, and I think you and I have had this conversation before. Do other states have model salaries and actual salaries? And so do we have, because you kind of show both. We're only funding the model salary. I mean, that's really the discussion. So my question is, do other states have model and actual? And so when you represent other states, are you representing their model and actual? And then my other one is more of a comment than a question. But I think as you look at the time teachers spend, one, I think you underestimate that time. And two, it's not like you can get another job. It's not the old days. In the old days, a teacher had this whole summer off. They could go get a construction job. They could go work at the grocery store. Seen it happen here a lot in my life. And then that changed. And obligations became more 12 months than 9 months. And so just a little more discussion on that. So.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, great questions. And I did a little more digging into this issue of model salaries in other states. So, so the only state adjacent to Wyoming that also has something of a model salary would be Idaho. So Idaho sets a minimum salary. They have recently really increased that. So I'll show you some numbers for Idaho that are from 2018, because that was the last year they have published data up on their website. And there they had a beginning salary of $23,354. That compares to Wyoming's of $37,540. So that was their model salary. They just increased that though by quite a bit. So their new minimum salary, which I believe went into effect this year, is $35,000. So that's much closer to Wyoming's model beginning salary of 37. So Idaho's new minimums are close to their actuals. Their old model ones are fairly different. So like Wyoming are a lot lower. Other states in the region don't have model and actual. So why Idaho, my understanding is Idaho doesn't have the same kind of salary schedule that Wyoming does, but they have this kind of legal minimum. They have a couple of points. And I'd be happy to send you the information I have on them. And I believe there are like 9 other states that have, that's somewhere around 10. I don't recall off the top of my head, that have model salaries. So, and I haven't looked into all of those. I looked into Idaho the most because they're the closest. And then back on your point about weeks of work, I agree with you that it's difficult to sort of know how many weeks is a teacher working. So again, like I said, when I looked at the American Community Survey, where teachers are self-reporting how many weeks do I work, a good chunk of them say I work 52 weeks of the year, just like private sector workers say I work 52 weeks of the year. I'm not sure if they're literally working all 52 weeks and they take no vacation days, or if they're saying, I've got a full-time, full-year job. Of the ones that don't report that, like I said, about 1/3 of them are saying I work 40 weeks a year. So kind of 3 full-time weeks, maybe spread out over the summer. But certainly people could be working more than that. So I definitely take that point that it's hard to say. And my guess is, a teacher with new preps or a younger teacher is probably working a lot more weeks of the year than someone who's been teaching the same classes for a while and kind of has it dialed in.
Before I go to Senator Koss and then Representative Schwartz, Chairman Summers, you said something about watching the screen. Had you had your hand up for some period of time before I recognized you?
No, Mr. Chairman, I just know that if under screen share, I can only see like 2 people.
Oh, I see. No,
I
I've
want-
got-
it's easier to de-share the screen for you to be, as chair, to be able to see
Okay,
everybody.
I got you. Well, I've got it set so everybody who has their video on is on my screen. Now, they may be the size of a postage stamp, but I'm trying to catch everybody. All right, Senator Cost and then Representative Schwartz, and after that, Senator Coe had his hand up.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Stoddard, when you talk about Idaho and their salary just jumped to 35,000 or somewhere around there, that's both county and state contribution because they don't have a state equitable funding, correct? So the rich counties can put lots in, the poor counties can't do much. Okay.
Mr. Chairman, Senator, that's my understanding. That's my understanding. Yeah, that they've set a legal minimum, and I'm not as familiar with all the details of, you know, what their state contribution is relative to the local contribution, but yeah, that's my understanding.
Representative Schwartz and then Senator Coe.
You're muted, Andy.
Sorry. Thank you, Ms. Senator Hicks, Mr. Chairman. In a similar vein to weeks worked, anecdotally from all the teachers I know, in terms of hours per week, I would suggest that 45 might be a rather low estimate. They do a lot of work that's outside of the defined scope of their jobs. Do you take that into consideration?
So Mr. Chairman, Representative Schwartz, that's what teachers report in that survey. So they're asked in the American Community Survey, they ask how many hours of work do you work on average in your usual, like, I don't remember the exact survey language, but it's like your usual week or your typical week. How many hours do you work? And on average, they report 45 hours, or sorry, 44 hours of work. Now, obviously there's a range, right? Some teachers are reporting more than that. Some teachers are reporting less. You know, it's self-reported. They're having to remember. So, you know, I certainly take your point. Both of those numbers, the numbers for non-teachers and for teachers, are self-reports. So they're what a person, you know, responds to the survey and says, this is how much I'm working.
Great, thank you.
Senator Coe, and then I saw Representative Simpson and Representative Harshman.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. You know, if you look at the history of recalibration, and Dr. Stoddard's been involved in all this, and thank you for that. Going back to 05, 10, and 15, clearly the biggest jump that we made in our model salaries was in 2005, and we were significantly behind, and we ended up significantly higher, if you will, with the 7 adjoining states. If I see your last graph there, going back to Representative Simpson, he's brought this up before as well. The only state in our 7-state region that really is still up there with us now is Utah. Is that correct? Rather than Montana and Idaho, you know, North Dakota, South Dakota, Colorado?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Coe, so let's see, I think I am presenting in a couple of slides the actual salaries. I'll just bump ahead just so you can see. Let's see, so Nebraska is the highest right now, and you're correct that Utah, and you know, actually there's kind of a cluster of states that are close. You know, we'll maybe get into that a little bit more, but I would certainly say other states have gained a lot of ground relative to Wyoming, that there used to be a much bigger gap. And at least when you're looking at the model salary, you know, actual salaries are still above, but the model salary is kind of in the mix. And maybe I'll defer more questions on that till we kind of look at that in a little more detail.
Well, and Mr. Chairman, thank you. That was really my point. You know, we've kind of, the lines have merged, and all 7 lines have almost merged. So thank you for that, Dr. Stoddard.
Representative Simpson and then Representative Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Stoddard, you compared and developed a ratio of salaries of teachers compared to comparable occupations. And then you took the next step and compared the hours worked by those comparables. But in the presentation today, you've never quite brought that to a closure. in your last paragraph on page 7 of your report, you do bring it to head. Would you verbally describe to us, are teachers in Wyoming paid more or less than what comparables are? Thank you.
Representative Simpson, I think she broke from her she hasn't completed her presentation. If that helps, she broke from her presentation to take questions. I think there's more to come, but go ahead, Dr. Stoddard.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative Simpson, I believe you and I had some correspondence about this, and I think I need to still get clarity on exactly what numbers you want. So let me state a couple, and maybe I can get closer. So right now, teachers make about 85% of what professional and technical workers make in Wyoming. That would be 88% if you look at that narrower set of occupations. So they make about 85%. If we look at the kind of the hours range, what's that, or the weeks of work rather range, weeks of work range from between kind of 76 to 83%. So one way maybe if this is what you're getting at, is there's kind of this 2 percentage point gap. Maybe teachers are making sort of 2% more per hour, 2 percentage points more, the 85 compared to the 83. Is that your question, or am I?
No, you're on the right track.
Okay.
Mr. Chairman. Yeah, the question is, are Wyoming teachers comparable to other occupations?
So again, if I'm looking at actual salaries, as opposed to model salaries, I would say the actual salaries, they're paid a little bit more per weeks of work than professional and technical workers. If I'm looking at model salaries are well within that range. So model salaries, if anything, are kind of a little on the lower end of that range when we're looking at model salaries per weeks of work. They're on the lower end compared to professional and technical workers in comparable occupations. Is that what you wanted me to hit? Okay, it's a little difficult because we've got these two salaries that we're looking at, and then these two different comparisons. So, yeah.
I saw Representative Harshman and then Representative Connolly and Chairman Summers next. Representative Harshman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Find that unmute button. Dr. Stoddard, thank you. And I just a couple questions. The first was really about that weeks of work. And you mentioned that a large group of teachers had put down 52 weeks. And then also a large group of those comparable occupations had put down 52 weeks. And is it my understanding you just threw those out then on both those groups?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative Harshman, I view that as people, I don't think that that's literally that nobody ever takes any vacation ever. Certainly it could be, but I think that's probably when someone's being asked in a survey question, how many weeks of work do you work? They tell the survey representative, I work the whole year. Well, how many weeks? Well, 52 weeks, the whole year. I work the whole year. So, so that's certainly if you actually, I don't think I put this in, but if you look at the average number of self-reported teacher weeks per year, and then the self-reported private industry weeks per year, those averages are about 90%. So teachers are reporting working 90% of the weeks per year. But like I said, the hard thing about the American Community Survey is it does include multiple jobs. So there's not really a way to, they don't ask how many weeks do you work in your primary job, how many weeks do you work in your secondary job. It's kind of all lumped together.
So, Mr. Chairman, my question, Doctor, then, so you threw out those folks that put, I work every day. You threw it out on both of them.
That's correct. Yeah. So, Mr. Chairman, what I did instead was to say, okay, that's one way you could look at it. What do they self-report? The other way is I'm going to go to the employers and say, what do employers say? The Wyoming, what their contract days is 185 contract days. what do employers report on weeks of work? They report, hey, I give my employees 15 to 20 paid vacation days. Now, again, it could be, we're living in a weird world where it could be, a person who has a private sector job during their vacation, they're still responding to work emails and they're still doing some work. This is from the employer's perspective. So from the employer's perspective, they're saying, I give my workers 15 to 20 weeks of, or 15 to 20 days of work. Wyoming employers say you have 185 contract days. So taking those, the employer side, yeah, that's
Sure.
where.
Okay, thank you. I just so we're clear. And then I think that 185, that's the model funded days. Some districts have more days than that work, that have 188, 190 contract days, even though the model funds 185. I think it's important. And the other part, and maybe you have this farther in, really this work of inflation, and when you see these flatten out over the last 10 years, and just wondering when you're at some point going to talk, or are you going to, is that in your analysis?
Mr. Chairman, Representative Harshman, do you mean talking about the growth in wages, that it's flattened? Is that your
Yeah, and as far as how the impact inflation, because you see back in, in 2003 or 4, it's like 98% congruent with the model. We keep saying, districts ought to run the model. And you've seen that go down now to about 90. And I think what you've kind of seen is, the model salary, if you inflated that, as you mentioned maybe earlier with the ECAs, it would probably be where the actual salary's at right now. And I think so districts have responded to that by to remain competitive in that. But anyway, thanks, and appreciate the information on that. I just want to make sure those 52 weekers were the same on both groups. Thank you.
That's correct. Yeah.
Representative Connolly, and then Representative Summers had his hand up.
Thank you, Chairman Kinski. Thanks, Dr. Stoddard. I have a question. I want to go back to the hours worked per week. I too have used the ACS in some of my work and understand some of the issues regarding self-reporting. But one of the things that concerns me when I kind of looked at some other studies that exist out there, that the number that you're using is what those studies are indicating that teachers work in the building versus what they're working at home. And so one of the other studies that I saw kind of indicated that it's the 43 hours in the building, but another 11 hours at home. And so that the real number is 54. So all of the grading and the prep that gets done at home isn't necessarily included in that self-reporting. And so I'm curious if you've looked at some of that other kind of information.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Connolly, I'm glad that you've got some familiarity there. It's difficult because the American Community Survey doesn't say in the building, it just says how many hours did you work. So my own inference is that they're including the prep and the grading time. I'm certainly aware that there are groups that also look at how many hours did you work outside of the building and then add that on to that. Yeah, my view is that I'm taking sort of teachers at their work, how many hours did you work? This is how many hours I worked, that they're including that. You certainly do see those numbers creeping up over time, to be sure. So, I've done some work actually looking at teacher hours. And you see that for both non-teachers and for teachers, that the hours of work worked per week has gone up over the last 20 years. I don't think contract hours have changed as much. And so I do think that that's including some of the grading time, but I certainly take your point that these are difficult numbers to pin down in an exact way.
Yeah, thank you, Ms.
Follow on, Representative.
Yeah, just thank you, Mr. Chairman. So it would be fair, Dr. Stoddard, to say that the figure that you're using is probably the minimum.
Mr. Chairman and Representative Conley, so I would say teachers are reporting that they're working 44 hours a week. Other individuals are reporting that they're working 45 hours a week. So I think one perspective would be, hey, I'm being too generous by ignoring the hours of work per week. I didn't discount for that at all. I think your perspective would be maybe that 45 hours is the wrong number. Maybe it's a different number. I'm not sure, which of those it is. So that's why I didn't make any adjustment for hours of week per work. I just went with weeks of work.
Thank you. I saw Representative Summers and then Representative Obermueller.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And, I think it's really hard to get at that number. It's not just teachers anymore. If you look in all occupations across America, people are putting in after hours fairly consistently. I mean, you talk about, you just name the profession. It's not just ranchers anymore that work after 5 o'clock. It's, I think, everybody in America. So I was interested in one of your charts, and I don't know, you could go back to it or tell me more about it. But one thing I thought was interesting is we've talked about Wyoming's model salary flattening out after 2010, basically flat. But it looked like the U.S. teacher, when you showed, didn't you have a slide that had kind of the whole U.S. picture on it, comparable wages, or was that all just Wyoming? It was one of your early slides. It has teacher wages in the U.S. kind of flattened along with Wyoming's in a fairly similar manner over time.
Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers, are you seeing my screen right now?
No.
Okay, let me see if I have to reshare that then. Sorry, I just realized the highlighting around it. Was it this slide that you're referring to, Representative Summers?
No, it was the first slide you had.
Okay, I think the very first slide just had the model. This one has the US. This is the first slide I showed with the US. And so this is showing the ratio of teacher salaries to professional and technical.
No, so maybe I misunderstood. Go back to your first slide.
Okay, hang on.
And that was it.
This one
Not
here?
that, no, the next one.
This one. This is just Wyoming.
That's just Wyoming.
This
Okay.
is just Wyoming. Yeah. This one is looking at that ratio in Wyoming. So basically taking the black line compared to the blue line. And so this is the ratio in Wyoming, and the red dotted line is the ratio in the US. And you can see that ratio in the US is super flat. Like
I guess my question
stayed at 77% for a long time.
I guess my question then, and maybe you have it in another document, if we were to track Wyoming and US teacher salaries, and I know you've had that before, do you have a table on that, or will you have one later on that I can see that?
Mr. Chairman, yeah, Representative Summers, yes. So we're getting there in just a second. So this is kind of
perfect
about teachers relative to other workers. And then we'll talk about, neighboring states and all of that in just a second.
All right, thank you.
All right, next I had Representative Obermueller.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The American Community Survey, I just pulled that up and to see what it actually asked in terms of the questions. One of the questions, when they get to occupation, they say, what was the person's main occupation? So if I were a teacher, I'd fill that out. It says, for example, 4th grade teacher. And that's the only question they ask about that. So to me, if I was a homeschool teacher, or I was a private teacher, or I was a public school teacher, this survey would not make that distinction. Is that correct?
Mr. Chairman, and sorry, I've forgotten if you're a senator or representative.
Representative.
Thank you. So there is a question at some point, I do believe, in that survey about so they code it up as an industry, and they code it up at some point as are they working in the private sector? Are they self-employed? Are they working in the public sector? So you do know if they're a public school teacher, as opposed to, saying they're a teacher and self-employed, which might be, homeschooling or something. So you do know the sector that they're working in.
Follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Please.
Now the American Community Survey is a statistical sample. So this question about what was the person's main occupation, that's overall. How many total samples of workers or people in Wyoming was part of this survey? how many actually fit into let me rephrase that. How many people in that survey actually fit into that narrow definition of teacher in public schools? What was your sample size?
Mr. Chairman, Representative, I would need to go back and get you the exact number. The numbers have changed over time because the American Community Survey has grown. So it's now pretty much a mini census. So it's not, it's not a full census, but it's something on the order of 1% of individuals in Wyoming. So it would by no means be everybody. That's unquestionably true, but it's the best data we have for comparing across states and over time like that. So
1%,
yeah.
1% would put it around, just roughly 5,000 people overall, of which some percentage of that would have gone to teachers in public schools, but it's totally random, is it not? The 5,000 just go out randomly.
Mr. Chairman, that's correct. That's correct. So every year it's a different sample. It's not the same people in each year. But yes, that's correct. So that's one reason why I largely draw on wages from the occupational employment statistics, because that's a much more comprehensive survey of employers. So the wage data is a lot less noisy in that from year to year than the American Community Survey. But in terms of finding out how many hours, how many weeks do people work, that's the best we've got from individuals telling us, what they're doing.
All right, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you.
All right, I didn't see anybody else that had any further questions at this point. Dr. Stoddard, we've got another hour to go on teacher salary, and if you'd pick resume, and we'll take it from there. Thank you.
All right, you bet. So you all are seeing my screen again then?
We are.
Okay, so let's, okay, so now we're going to talk. So one way that I think about this is when we think about teacher salaries compared to salaries of other professionals, there's certainly sort of this fairness aspect, but the other aspect that's important is kind of thinking about a college student trying to decide, what do I want to do? And they're going to be comparing kind of working conditions and salaries across professions. When we think about teaching salaries in Wyoming compared to teaching salaries in neighboring states, that might be especially important if we're thinking about how do we attract people who've already decided, yeah, I definitely want to be a teacher. Where do I want to teach? So, so this is, I believe, the graph that Representative Summers was asking for. So here it is. So in black here, we have the actual salaries in Wyoming. In the dashed line here, that's the model average salary. The blue line is showing what actual salaries are on average in the US. And the orange line is showing what average salaries are in adjacent states. And I also included North Dakota because in some years, committee members have asked for that because North Dakota also has kind of a fairly resource-based economy. So what you can see is that, again, actual salaries were fairly in line with what was going on in adjacent states in the early part of this period. After the big salary increase, they increased and tracked the average salary of the US, so much higher. And that persisted until the last couple of years. So it's been in the last basically 4 years that that actual salaries have fallen behind the average for the US. And then you can see model salaries, again, really increased relative to adjacent states and now have begun to really narrow relative to adjacent states. And then this is the graph that I believe Senator Coe was referring to, which is now comparing, breaking out all of those adjacent states. So again, you can see Wyoming actual is that solid line on top. The dashed line would be the model salaries. And then these are all of the adjacent states. So here's Nebraska, you can see is the next highest. So Nebraska is above model salaries, below the actual in Wyoming, but certainly above the model salary in Wyoming. You can see the model salary now is very close to kind of this this clump of everybody else except for South Dakota. So South Dakota still lags, but if we're looking at Utah and Montana and Idaho, they've all really clustered together, quite close. The model salary is a little bit above that, but very close to those others. And then I did some focus groups this year with districts in Wyoming, and a number of them, particularly that border other states, talked about competition with specific districts in other states. So what I just showed you there was the average. This is showing you kind of the distribution. So how do salaries range across these different states? So my own state of Montana does not collect salary data. So there's nothing there for you guys. I certainly know some data points for different districts, but there's nothing comprehensive. So, so the right of this table is kind of showing you the lowest paid districts. So districts in the 10th percentiles, kind of towards the bottom. What are the lowest paid districts paid in various states? You can see, like I said, Idaho has really jumped up here. Idaho is a little different. I'll also point out, because Idaho reports salaries for all certified employees together. It's not just teachers. So that makes them a little bit different. But in general, you can see that both the model and the actual salary for the lowest paid districts still exceeds kind of lowest paid districts in many other places. Here's the next column over is the median. So looking at the district right in the middle, what's that middle look like for Wyoming in comparison to other states? And here you can see a difference. So you can see that even the actual salaries, the middle salary in Wyoming, the middle district, is still well above the middle district in other states. But the model, the middle of the model, is below that of both Nebraska and Idaho. Again, with the caveat on Idaho. And then we can look at kind of the highest paid districts. So I've given that for the 75th percentile, the 90th, and the 95th, because again, there was this sense that some of these very well paid districts in other states are maybe competing strongly with very well paid districts in Wyoming. And you do see that to some extent. I gave you, just in case you wanted to know, what's the very highest paid district across all of these states. And then how many of these districts have an average that exceeds $65,000. So, in Wyoming, there are 2 districts with an average that exceeds that. Idaho has more, again, with that caveat. Colorado and Utah have very few compared to how many districts they have. So that gives you a sense, again, that I think Wyoming is doing well at the bottom. The median, especially when you're looking at the model, is kind of in the mix with other states. And higher paid districts, again, Wyoming is competitive with the highest paid districts, but certainly there are some highly paid districts in other states that are paying more than some districts in Wyoming. That's certainly true. Then when we're comparing across these other states, sometimes there are questions about, well, do working conditions vary? So again, these are contract days, a state minimum contract days. As I think has already been pointed out, districts have the option to have more than that. Some states don't have a requirement. So Wyoming definitely has a high required number of contract days with 185. The 175 student days, so the days that students are in school, is similar to North Dakota. It's also pretty similar to Utah. I also put in contract hours in Wyoming, again, a little bit higher than other states. And then I put in average class sizes, both for elementary students and for high school students. With the exception of North Dakota, Wyoming's class sizes tend to be much smaller than other states. Okay, so I see a hand up, and since I'm next,
Senator Rossler.
and talk about let's take that.
Thanks, Mr. Chairman. I was curious on the contract hours and the contract days. There were calculations above where you tried to normalize salary based on contract days, number of hours worked, comparing industry to industry. I'm sort of curious what it looks like when you do a similar calculation and you take the chart that you're showing with average teaching salaries in neighboring states plus North Dakota, and then adjust that on a daily rate. I don't know if that's something that you have in appendices or you took a look at, but to the extent that Wyoming does have one of the higher commitments, you see Colorado, for example, has a full 10% lower commitment. I'm curious what it ends up looking like when you start controlling on the state by state basis salaries adjusted by contract days. And I realize that some states don't have that. You see no state requirement. But you do have the contract hours available, I think, for all of them. So have you looked at that analysis to see how it ends up when you basically have a 10% swing on actual obligation?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman. So one thing I would point out is that Colorado has the option in a number of districts do a 4-day school week, but then they have longer hours. So if you look at their contract hours, at least for elementary and middle school, they line up pretty well with Wyoming. I haven't done that. I certainly could. Contract hours vary a lot from elementary school to high school, so I'd have to think a little bit about how to do that. But certainly if that's something the committee would like to see, I'd be happy to do that. I'd probably use the contract hours just because that's available for the largest number of states.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and it might not be as significant as I think Dr. Stoddard, but when just a cursory glance at this, I do see circumstances where you have what appears to be a full 10% in some circumstances that might be interesting to look at, but it might not. Thank you.
Senator Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Stoddard, first of all, the contract hours, that's just the time in the classroom with the actual students. That's not the contract as far as the 185 days or the 190 or whatever that's required by the state, because the students are only required 175 of those days. So the 900, 10, 50, and 1100 in elementary, middle school, and then high school, for us, if you were to take that to that, it wouldn't be the actual showing of the contract then, because the contracts are 185 days. The other thing I wanted to ask you was, in Idaho, because of them not moving out specialists or anything, that would inflate that by a fair amount, wouldn't it? The salary schedule for them?
Mr. Chairman and Senator Cost, that's correct. I think not pulling that out, it does inflate it for Idaho. That's the way they report their data, so I don't have something better than that. Your point on contract hours, I believe that is correct. Again, we get back into sort of these same questions we had before about workload. These are contract hours, doesn't include, grading time and stuff like that. Having a larger class size, that affect how much grading you're having to do after hours. So I've given you the information that I think is most standardized, but certainly I think, you can weigh that in different ways.
Senator Cost, you have a follow-up?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, please. Actually, having worked in the school district for 31 years, I can pretty much guarantee those are right. But the point I was just making was, I'm not going to get into the hours they work, because some people work more, some people work less. There's no way you can ever evaluate that to any real. Your averages are as good as anybody's. I mean, you've just got to take some average and go with it, or we'd never have any data of any accuracy. But I just wanted to make sure we understood the difference between the contract days and the contract hours. Thank you.
Thank you. Chairman Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And this is a little bit of a tangential question. It's really not salaries, but since you have it up here, the disparity between 160 contract days and Wyoming's 185. My question is there a federal requirement on contract days? And if not, can you provide us a chart of contract days for every state in the country? And my question is, we can cut expenses, pare expenses by simply paring the number of contract days. That's not that's a fairly easy thing. It may not make sense education-wise, but it's certainly within our prerogatives. So I'm trying to understand kind of what the norm is out there in the US, what the feds require, and obviously we have our own statutes on it, but that's something we can have a discussion on. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers. So there's a link at the bottom of this, and I believe I also have it in the report there, this ncs.ed.gov, this table 5_14. That shows you it for all of the states. I'd be happy to send that table separately for you. I will add, in that table, Wyoming is listed at 180 contract days. After talking to, legislative services, that's, that's not obviously right. So, you may need to take that table with a grain of salt, but I think that's because there has been a more recent change in Wyoming. So it may be that some of their information was dated. So yes, so you can definitely get that. There is not a federal requirement. And again, like I said, there's not even a state requirement in some states. They leave it up to the districts. And contract hours, though, I think are more commonly set by the state. I'm not aware of a federal contract hours number, but I could certainly look that up. There may be that you need that for, federal funding.
Thank you. If you would check on that, I would appreciate it.
Yeah, I'd be happy to do that.
So, Dr. Stoddard, my mic is open, your mic is open. One of us has something, I think your cell phone, you might need to put it on quiet. Every time you get a text message, I think we're getting dinged.
Sorry.
So that's okay, that's fine. Before I go to Senator Rothfuss and Representative Schwartz, I have a question for Dr. Stoddard. I show we're on slide 15 of 35 slides. Is it 35 slides on teachers and non-teachers, or is it 35 just on the teachers?
Yeah, just on the teachers. So.
Okay, so we've got a little bit of ground to cover yet. Senator Rothfuss and then Representative Schwartz.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Stoddard, I wanted to follow up on Senator Cost's question, which I thought was very thoughtful, and so I just did a little quick math as well. It almost seems like the contract hours are meaningless based on the previous discussion we had, because if you're obligated for 185 contract days in Wyoming, for example, and then you look back at the average work week being 44 hours and everything else that we talked about above that were your basis assumptions for the comparative calculations. I don't see any meaning for the contract hours, which based on what Senator Cost said are simply classroom contact hours more than they have any actual meaning of the amount of work done. So I guess I see a little bit of a discrepancy in the basis of comparative evaluation, where it might not be contract hours that matter. Because again, in Wyoming, if you compare Wyoming and Colorado in your chart, I don't know how much they actually work in Colorado. I don't know how many hours in a year of real work, if you're assuming 44 hours a week. How many weeks in Colorado, if you've got 160 contract days versus Wyoming, the 185. So if you really tried to put it on an equivalent number of hours worked in a year basis for each of the states, I think that would be more of an appropriate comparison that should be the numerator or the denominator as we're comparing on a state-by-state basis. Does that make sense?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Senator Rothfuss, just to clarify one more time. So Colorado allows 4-day school weeks. So a number of school districts don't have school on Fridays. So in terms of weeks of work, so their contract hours are very similar to Wyoming. They're working longer days, 4 days of the week, as opposed to working shorter days, 5 days of the week. So that's why their days are so short. Their state minimum allows for that 4-day school week. So I don't necessarily think they're working 10% less, but they're working 10% longer on the days that they're working, if that makes sense. I don't want to get too far into the weeds. I know the chairman would like us to keep going, but that's the explanation there, I believe.
Sure, Mr. Chairman and Dr. Stoddard, I see that. I guess what I'm saying is I'd like to know more about that and really understand on an apple-to-apple basis who is working how much, because if we're at 185 contract days and we're higher than basically every other state, I would like to understand that. And I do see what you're saying about Colorado, but I don't actually know what the implications in terms of total hours worked for Colorado then are.
So Representative Schwartz and then Chairman Summers.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My question was similar to Senator Rothfuss. I'll just say, I was just running numbers and we're getting 6-hour days basically. But I'm not as eloquent or as analytical as the senator, so I'll stop.
Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I think the reason I'm interested in Colorado has one of the lowest wages and it has one of the lowest contract days. And I'm assuming that is related. And, you know, if we had a model salary or whatever and cut the contract days, you know, we could, in effect, we would be cutting salary and actual salary. And so I do think it's important to kind of get this comparison to understand a little better about the relationship between contract days and salary and the two states.
Thank you. Anybody else before she resumes on her teacher salary presentation? All right, Dr. Stoddard, please resume.
Yeah, I'd be happy to look into that. I would just point you maybe to noticing that it appears to me that part of what's happening in Wyoming is that you're paying for relatively more days of in-service. So you've got 175 student days, same as North Dakota, but more contract days, similar to Utah. But I'd be happy to see if I can dig into sort of in-service days more if you'd be interested. Let me move on and talk about teacher retention then, and I'll try to go through this more quickly. So as we've had these salary patterns, bearing them in mind, let's see what's happened in terms of retention. So basically what happened in Wyoming is that you had really low retention, or really low exit rates beginning in 2010, kind of about the time that salaries flattened. Exit rates, especially when you're looking at kind of these more experienced teachers, do seem to creep up a little, but still we're talking about exit rates in the range of 8% here, 8 to 10%. So relatively low exit rates, but there has been kind of a modest drift up. In terms of the fraction of new hires, that's basically remained the same over time. So and then this year, one thing that's new this year that you, I think you saw the last recalibration, but we haven't done in intervening years, was that the Department of Workforce Services is able to track teachers, track people who shift occupations if they're staying in Wyoming or if they're moving to a state that that they have a relationship with. So if they've moved to Colorado or Montana or Nebraska, New Mexico, or South Dakota, then we can find them. And so this is telling you something about of the teachers who are leaving. So this is looking at a 2-year period here. So about 10% of the teachers that are leaving, 64% of them are going to another job in Wyoming. So the row below that tells you what their wage was in Wyoming and when they were teaching. And then the third row here shows you the wage that they had when they went to Wyoming and took another job. So basically, teachers who are leaving teaching in Wyoming on average are taking an enormous pay cut. So they're not on average. Now, there are going to be some people, of course, who are not going to be the average, but by and large, they're not leaving because they're hired out for higher pay. If we look at the third column here, about 8% of the teachers who left moved to another state to teach, and let's move to another state for which we have knowledge of it. Some of them are going to be unknown. That's this 24%, but 8% of them left and went to another state. On average, those who left and went to another state and were teaching, again, took a pay cut. Most of those are young teachers, or about half of them are young teachers. So it may be that they're taking this pay cut because their experience in Wyoming is discounted when they move to this other state, or it could be, you know, salaries, as I've showed you, in Wyoming are higher than other states. Then there's another small fraction who move to another state and do something besides teaching. And then there's a bunch of people where we don't really know what they did. They either retired, left the workforce, or went somewhere else that we don't know about. About half of them are over 55. So most of those people probably retired. So this is basically saying, destination wages, at least, to the degree that we have information, don't indicate that people are leaving in general. When they leave teaching, largely they're not leaving teaching for a higher salary. Again, I would just emphasize, of course, there are going to be some exceptions to that, but on average, that's what's happening. I maybe won't go through this, but I figured many of you would be interested. This is it again in the companion paper, just tells you what exit rates are by the different counties, what their wage was before they left, what their wage was in the place that they went to. You'll notice there are a couple of these counties that have pretty high exit rates. So I'd point to Hot Springs and Platte and Weston in particular. But again, I'll defer more comment on that for questions at the end. So then the last section then is to not think about teachers leaving teaching, but pulling teachers in. So how do we get high quality teachers into teaching in Wyoming, and has that changed over time? So I would emphasize again that we don't have great data on this for Wyoming. So the best data, the best kind of state data links teachers to students. And when you have that kind of data, then you can say, hey, the new teachers we hired with higher salaries, they're really strong. Or we can say, hey, it looks like the teachers who leave are not particularly good teachers. Maybe this was a bad fit. We're fine that they left. Or, conversely, it could be that people who leave teaching are really great teachers and they're leaving for some other kind of job. So I can't look at that. What I can do is look at master's degrees, at whether or not they have subject matter experience and something about the college that they went to. So basically over time, there has not been a lot of change is what we're going to see in all of these graphs. So a slight increase in the fraction of new hires who have a master's degree, a slight increase in the fraction who have a major other than education. So they could be an education major and say a math major, or maybe they're just a math major. So there's been a slight increase in that, not really dramatic. There's not been much of a change, maybe a slight decline in the fraction of new hires who are getting a bachelor's degree from outside of Wyoming. So this is comparing kind of the 2010 to 2014 period to the 2015 to 2019 period. This is looking at new hires of basically newly minted bachelor's degrees. So somebody who's a new hire and they got their bachelor's degree within 5 years of when they got hired. And what I would point to here is that a number of these kind of more traditional, I would say sort of traditional public university, traditional four-year universities are showing declines. And the places where you're seeing increases are places like Western Governors University, Valley City State. You're seeing declines though at places like, MSU Billings, Utah State, BYU, Idaho, Montana State, University of Montana. So kind of all those more traditional ones are a decline. So I view that with some concern. I've heard mixed opinions about places like Western Governors University, for example, in the focus groups. There's not been much of a change in terms of just looking now at the University of Wyoming. Looking at kind of average ACT scores of those who are majoring in education versus average ACT scores of all graduates. It's been pretty flat in education, maybe a little bit of an increase in your average ACT for University of Wyoming as a whole. The things that concern me the most, and that, again, you haven't seen before, are these next couple of graphs. So one thing that I was sort of surprised by this year was kind of digging into your teaching pool. So this is looking at the percentage of bachelor's degrees that are awarded in education in Wyoming. And you're the blue line here. And you can see you started above where it was in adjacent states and have really declined. So there's been a decline in the number of students who are majoring in education overall across the US, but that decline has been sharper in Wyoming.
Dr. Stoddard?
Mm-hmm.
could you explain your left axis?
Yes. So, this is so take all of the people who got a bachelor's degree. So back in 2005, about 15% of them in Wyoming got a bachelor's degree in education. And you saw that back here on this chart. This was showing for the University of Wyoming, you went from, 14.4% getting a BA in education, and it's down not quite half, but close to, but down to 8.2%. That's also been the case in other states. So, here's Idaho in green. Idaho is even sharper, but these other states, Montana, Colorado, well, Colorado's kind of weird, but Montana, Nebraska, Utah, those other states are not as sharp of a decline. So that especially concerned me when I did this next graph, where I was looking at, okay, what's the right percentage? Well, different states have different needs for numbers of students. So I took how many K through 12 students you have and how many new bachelor's degrees you have in education. So that ratio, so there's basically, half a BA per K through 12 student. I know that's kind of hard to interpret, but what's happened in Wyoming is the number of teachers you have graduating, or the number of individuals you have graduating in education at the University of Wyoming relative to the number of K through 12 students you have, that's low and it's not improving. And that's different than, say, Utah, which has actually kind of improved, and some of these other states. So, so when you're thinking about
Dr. Stoddard, just a quick comment. Since Chairman Kinski's away, I have the ability to step in here. This is a chart that I have really wanted to see from you for quite a long time, because I was fairly certain that other states are able to maintain their share of teachers within their state that are homegrown versus Wyoming. And so I do appreciate this chart very much. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Summers. Yeah, so this is, I should have mentioned this actually, because you pointed that out in terms of homegrown. I kind of looked at this at public institutions and private institutions, and yeah, I was surprised to see that Wyoming really seems to be lagging behind in this area, and that does seem like something really worth focusing on, especially as you think about kind of recruitment into teaching in the future. So the last thing I'll just add is, again, I did these interviews with districts this year. A lot of them do talk about, of course, hiring challenges, and none of those challenges are permanent issues. We've got a really snowy pass that teachers have to get down. There aren't a lot of amenities in our areas. A number of districts do report, especially if they're adjacent to another state, do report competition with that state. That's why I've given you more information about that. A lot of them also report difficulty competing with other Wyoming districts. There were a couple of things that came up a lot. One was special education, especially kind of more specialized special education positions, and then career and technical education. Trying to dig into this a little bit more was difficult. A number of districts reported that they fill positions with long-term substitutes or emergency credentials. It turns out, I don't think you guys collect really great data on that. So I went to PTSB. They gave me information on the number of professional industry and career, the PIC permits. But their data they only have it since 2014. It was really terrible in 2014, so I didn't even report it really. It's not clear to me that there's much of a pattern there. The number of substitute permits is hard to interpret, because the University of Wyoming and a lot of other programs require people to get a substitute license. So that's going to be related to what's going on there. But that, again, seems like something that could be collected. How many positions in a year are being filled with kind of a non-standard, either a long-term sub or some other kind of temporary certification. Right now, there's not a good way of calculating that. So I'll just conclude here and then take any final questions. So Again, when we're looking at the actual teaching wages relative to salaries in other comparable professions, that's fallen from about 97% in 2009 when it reached its high. It's currently at about 85%. That ratio is above that for most other states. So, again, Wyoming ranks about 5. The ratio of model salaries to comparable worker salaries is about 75%, similar to the average in the US, a little below the US average. I view those as being somewhat consistent with at least my interpretation of the ratio of weeks of work for teachers to professional non-teachers. So viewing that range, and we've discussed this, there are other ways to interpret this, but as a range kind of in that 76 to 83%, which is sort of what we see for the US as a whole. If we look at the regional teacher market, actual average salaries are about 13% higher than the average in other states, but that premium is definitely eroding. So, from its high of about 25%. Model salaries now are well within the range of average teaching salaries. Both the highest and the lowest paid districts in Wyoming have salaries well above those of comparable districts in the region. We discussed the issue of contract days, definitely more contract days in Wyoming, but again, your class sizes are a lot smaller, so hard to say where that falls in terms of work effort. On average, teachers that leave teaching in Wyoming do not appear to be doing that for financial reasons. So whether they're working in Wyoming in a non-teaching field or they're teaching in another state, at least in the very first job that they have after leaving, they're not paid more on average. In fact, they're paid significantly less. So again, we don't have a lot of information about teacher quality, but it does appear that higher salaries are associated with lower turnover, especially for new teachers. Higher teaching salaries have not drawn in more students into teaching majors. I think that was kind of the biggest surprise for me, was that the period where you've had really high salaries, I kind of expected that would make teaching more attractive to college students in Wyoming in comparison with other states, and that wasn't the case. Again, like I said, districts are reporting higher teacher salaries in the past, help them be more competitive. We don't have great data on that. But definitely a common thread that there are difficulties in special ed and career and technical ed. So I presented a couple of recommendations this year. Certainly this is all information that you as a legislature can weigh. One proposal I had was, to set model salaries based on the wages of professional and technical workers. So one thing you could consider for the model salaries to say, hey, we would like to have salaries increase consistently with the external cost index. That external cost index is going to be very, very similar to the increase in wages of professional and technical workers, because we're drawing on the same kind of data here. So it's rapidly available. It's going to give you a consistent ECA. What might that look like? One thing you could consider as a legislature is to consider, setting some target. We'd like to have teachers' salaries in the model be hit some percentage of the wages of professional and technical workers. You could consider alternatives. I mean, certainly you could say, hey, here's what we'd like to be relative to the US average, or here's what we'd like to be relative to other states. We always want to be number one in the region, or we always want to, whatever. The advantage of using professional and technical workers is it's going to be the most rapidly available data. So if you choose something in that 76 to 83 or 85% range, that would be consistent with my interpretation of weeks of work. It would also be consistent with the US average. Just to give you an example, if you set your model at about 80% of professional and technical worker salary, and you didn't change anything else in the model, the actual paid would, based on past patterns, would be close to 90%. That would pretty much put you at the top of the nation. I also recommend, as you're thinking about this year, to collect data that tracks teacher quality more explicitly. If you choose to have really highly paid teachers, my view is you ought to figure out what you're buying for that. So a low cost thing to do that I think would be very easy would be to start collecting data on positions that are filled with long-term subs and temporary certifications. my view is that the best thing to do would be to start linking data on student outcomes with teachers. That's not necessarily to say that you have to have like a merit pay system, or, I know those things are very controversial, but it would tell you more about what's the kind of performance that we're getting out of new teachers when we pay them a lot. And then the last thing I would say is that my recommendation would be to consider what kinds of policies you might think about that allow you to recruit high ability students into teaching at the University of Wyoming. So I tried to look a little bit, I'm not totally clear on what loan forgiveness policies look like, or signing bonuses look like, or what the education department is doing at the University of Wyoming. But I think if you continue to pay highly relative to other places in the region, making sure college students know that, and that in particular, you're finding a way to bring in high ability students, that would be my recommendation. So that concludes this part on teachers, and I can take more questions.
Representative Summers and then Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And so Dr. Stoddard, and I think we finally kind of pushed Picus and Auden into doing this. But to me, a recommendation is I want a salary number, right? I don't want a 0.75, 0.73. That's to me is not a recommendation. That's a here's the crapshoot kind of. So that's one comment, and I appreciate Picus and Auden working with you to get us a final number. I think that's the biggest thing is I just like to see numbers, just straight out numbers. What's your recommendation, and how do we plug that into what we currently have? Obviously we make a decision, but we have to base. We don't want to argue amongst us over what you recommended, and so that's why I do really want a number. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative Summers, I would just say, I believe Picus and Auden gave you, I apologize, but two numbers. One basically saying, hey, look, if you really want to take this teacher quality stuff seriously, then go for the higher number. And, otherwise you're going to have really low turnover. You're going to basically have the same teachers and pay them more and not know what you're getting.
And then just a quick follow-up, Mr. Chairman.
Yes.
And so, Mr. Chairman, thank you. The follow-up is, and maybe you can provide this later rather than go over it, but how many states have performance-based salaries for teachers? And is that something that's on top of a normal salary? So would they have a base salary like like a model salary, and then from there they do a performance-based that rises above that? Or do they have a straight up performance based where you can get really low salary if you do really poorly? So a little bit more on that later is fine.
Senator Hicks and then Senator Rothfuss.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Dr. Stoddard, salaries are one indicator, but it's not an overall indicator of what the benefit package is. And Wyoming has historically not only kind of led the pack in salaries, but is the data readily available? We pay a percentage of the employee's retirement. We pay for insurance. We have, a range of insurance plans. But how do we ferret that data out as part of the overall compensation for teachers versus just salary? Because there's another part of the story there that's not being told also. And can we get that data and look at not the national average, but just look at the surrounding states and say what's comparable as far as retirement and health insurance benefits? Is that data available?
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, it's more fragmentary than what I've given you. I certainly can. I certainly looked at that some. It's not super consistent across the states. I'm happy to provide you with the information that I have, but it's not going to be as clean. But I'd be happy to provide you with what I've got.
Any data is better than no data.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Stoddard, I wanted to visit a topic that we've discussed in the past, and I was hoping to understand a little bit better from this year's recalibration, the influence of salary on talent. And I understand that you're encouraging us to try and collect a little more data so that we can do that analysis in the future and get more granularity. But at the last education committee where we visited, I asked if there was any way that we could understand that, because we obviously have as a part of our model that talent matters. It's right there in bold print, in fact, as the 10th recommendation point, that we don't just need teachers if we want to succeed. We need high quality teachers, and we need to be able to attract the best teachers. It's my understanding from our past conversations that when we're looking at these average data points and sort of what the market is doing at any given time, that we're looking basically at sort of the any old teacher, and that there's no sensitivity to that talent. So I'll begin by asking you to comment on, is there anything we can be looking at to understand what tells us whether we're providing salaries sufficient to attract talent and get high quality teachers versus a teacher that's not going to qualify for that category? And I'll have a follow-up after that. Thank you, Dr. Stoddard. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Ruffus, I definitely, your concern definitely resonates with me. So a couple of things I would say. So I've given you what I've got, in the sense that there is some evidence that kind of the quality of a teacher's training program matters. In that sense, I'm concerned, because it does appear to me that you're less likely to be drawing, candidates from the Utah states, the Montana states, the University of Wyoming, and more from kind of more specialized online programs, which vary in quality, and I've certainly heard from districts, some people saying, well, the University of Wyoming candidate isn't always great for our, really rural community. We prefer to grow our own. They're going to do an online training, degree program because they're more attuned to the needs of our students. So, I understand there's some subtlety there, but that's what we've got. Certainly one thing I looked at and didn't present any information about after talking it over with Dr. Auden and Dr. Pikus, I looked a little at test scores at the NAEP and test scores within Wyoming. Unfortunately, part of what's happened over this period is you increase salaries, but you also really decrease class size. So I did some statistical stuff to try to sort that out. It's nearly impossible to sort out. So I certainly think that the smaller class sizes, my professional opinion is they probably bought you something, but that was just too fragile to really present and pound the table with. So I would say, unfortunately, no, I don't think there's anything much better on teacher quality. And with respect to Co-Chairman Summers' comment about, performance pay, I certainly think you could collect more information about teacher performance without necessarily moving fully to a performance pay model, but just to try to understand how are teachers doing, the new ones compared to the older ones across different districts. So,
Senator Rothfuss, you had a follow on?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. So looking at your recommendations kind of based on that discussion, with the second recommendation being considering a target within 76 to 85% and contemplating teacher quality as being something that we're motivated to provide and cultivate. I'm curious how we can be confident that really any number in that range achieves that objective without better data. And specifically, when you're kind of looking at that putting us more towards an average, I guess the question I'd have is, these graphs are great statistically, but the proof is in when I put up a salary range, does anyone apply for the job? And I think we even had you do 4 years ago or something like that, an analysis on the number of applicants, and you did a lot of work on that. And we saw that as the wages went down, we were seeing fewer applicants. So I'm curious if you had an opportunity, as you were bringing this data to us, to look into again, whether we're still seeing a large number of applicants, because again, all I've got is anecdotal, and I hear that the number of applicants is way down relative to what it was a few years ago. Like 5 years ago, we had hundreds, now you get 4. But again, I've got anecdote. Do we have that data available to us? And if not, is that something that we should look to again, do a survey and try and get a sense of that for this recalibration so we can ensure the high quality teachers?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Office, you did collect that a number of years ago, and that was discontinued because districts were reporting it so inconsistently. So, so I think one of the recommendations, I believe Department of Workforce Services recommended, was if you had a more centralized application system or something like that, so that you could actually say, you know, here are how many unique applicants we have for elementary positions at, you know, this district or across the state. So I certainly think doing something like that again, or crafting those questions more carefully, would allow you to do that. Again, all I've heard is, you know, again, the kind of district reports anecdotally. There's not consistent data right now that's reported on numbers of applicants. You know, definitely people were saying, hey, we used to get hundreds before, now we get fewer. So I've heard similar anecdotes, but I can't speak to that more precisely.
Okay, quick final follow-up, Mr. Chairman, and then I'll yield.
Please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So Dr. Stoddard, again, then getting back to the core point, at the end of the day, you know, we're not going to show applicants these graphs and say, you know, this is how we set the salary, so you'll enjoy this salary. At the end of the day, it really is a market-based feature, and we tried to set a model salary before. It turned out the market and the model had nothing in common, which you presented to us nicely year after year. The 85%, as I see it, tries to basically track where we were still moving with the curve, and before we flattened out and went down. Is that, am I interpreting that correctly?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Office, that's correct. So, so setting it at 85% was when you kind of had a high of you know, kind of 95% of the actual salaries. So, I think what percentage you set it at might also depend on how you deal with the model, and if you're making other decisions that bring sort of model and actual in line with each other. So again, that's why I hesitate to give a number without having the other components of the model kind of set. But I agree with you. I think if you're picking a number that's closer to 85%, that points 3 and 4 of mine become more important. You know, make sure you're doing things that are bringing in high quality students and that are tracking teacher quality.
Well, Mr. Chairman and Dr. Stoddard, I'd ask you, you know, the 76 to 85, as I see it, the 85 really is kind of where we're at now. And anecdotally, I think we're hearing now that our applicant pool is lower. So I'd ask you to give that some more thought as we move forward. What is the number that gets us a large enough number of applicants that we can be selecting for quality and ensure that we have appropriate competition from other states if our objective is high quality? 85, which is the high end of your target, seems to me to kind of be the mediocre range. So I'd like to understand, and I don't know where we get the data, but we'll have more of these meetings, so we'll have opportunity and time between now and then to discuss. If we can understand, do we have to go to 88 to get a large number of applicants? Do we need to go to 95, which might be too high for us? If we could understand that number, and I'm fine with that number. I know Representative Summers wants a specific number, but I'm okay with this multiplier to understand what it takes for Wyoming on that multiplier to get a high quality applicant pool that allows us to attract from our surrounding states like we did 5 years ago, when anybody that wanted a career in education was seriously looking at moving to Wyoming. So I'd ask for that in the future, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Dr. Stoddard.
Thank you. So with respect to the teachers' salaries, before we go to Drs. Pikus and Auden, because they need to weigh in on this, does any other member of JAC or Recalibration have any questions for Dr. Stoddard? Representative Freeman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. In your research, did you come up with who trained the most teachers in Wyoming? For like, is University of Wyoming 50% of the teachers that are currently teaching in Wyoming, or are there other places?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Representative Friedman, I think I just blew through it really quickly. So let me just back up to that really quickly. So here is the percentage of new hires and which universities they're coming from. So in the 2015 to 19 period, a little more than half are coming from the University of Wyoming. The next most common place is Western Governors University. That's another 10%. The next most common place would be Black Hills State University in Chadron State. So that's giving you another, a little more than 10%. And then after that, it's kind of a smattering. So does that answer your question, Representative?
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I remember somebody reporting yesterday that 30% of the students or the teachers who are teaching in Wyoming came from the University of Wyoming. So when I saw that that statistic that over half of them are being trained when they're first hired, what's happening? And I'm sitting up here questioning myself whether or not that I heard 30%, but I'm pretty sure I did.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representatives, so there could be a couple of things going on there. So one is that the degree data is good sort of back to a certain point. So that's why I focus on new hires rather than focusing on everybody. So there are a fair number of there's difference there. And I'm also looking at people with a new BA. So if you're hiring in, say, a teacher from Montana who has 10 years of teaching experience, that's not showing up in this graph. I'm just trying to say, okay, let's look at new college graduates. Again, because I'm partly trying to think about that teaching pool, what's going to happen in the future for you. But I could certainly, double check those other numbers and say, okay, rather than looking at new hires, let me look at everybody and give you those figures. I'd be happy to do that.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And the other thing that would be kind of interesting is I attribute the doubling of the number of people at Valley State University as the homegrown. And I don't know which other universities are doing that, but in my experience, in my former job, I went to 11 different school districts, and that's what they were trying to do, is homegrown their students, because they couldn't get people to come into small town Wyoming. So it'd be interesting to me, and I guess it's just kind of anecdotal information, but what universities are really trying to help our districts get their people that go from paraprofessional to teachers.
Thank you. Representative Harshman?
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I think, like on this graph, Valley City State, I think that's a combination agreement with Casper College. I'd bet almost all of those kids are Casper College. And I'm just wondering if any of the others are like that at our community colleges.
Mr. Speaker, which one was it?
Valley City State.
And so I'm sorry, Doctor, but just clarify for me, Mr. Speaker, Valley City State University. So is this somebody that's offering degrees through Casper College? They're going there rather than finishing their degree through University of Wyoming. Is that what's happening?
I think there's options like that. Yes. And I think there's options like that, Mr. Chairman, all across the state at our community colleges. I think most of our community colleges offer, anywhere from 20 to 50 or more bachelor degrees agreements, with other out-of-state universities.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, these figures would show what their ultimate bachelor's degree said. I have to go back and look and see. I'm not sure that the data tells me where they got their associate's degree, but I could go back and look at that. But I agree with you. I mean, that's what I heard from a number of districts as well. And I think Western Governors University is another one that came up in those conversations as a place where sometimes paraprofessionals would get trained up in another place, an online program.
Senator Hicks and then Representative Freeman again.
Mr. Chairman, I was just going to ask the speaker, is that the reason that they're using Valley State University is because the University of Wyoming doesn't offer that?
Representative Harshman.
Mr. Chairman. Senator Hicks, I don't know. I think that's also offered by the University of Casper. But I think there's a lot of these agreements. I think you probably have them at every community college. I think Black Hill State has one in Gillette. And I was curious, up at the northern part of the state, if there's some agreements with Montana schools, those kind of things. But the kids generally then never leave Gillette or never leave Casper, and they just get their final degree from those institutions. And we do it in every field. I mean, from, physical therapy to whatever it might be.
So, Mr. Chairman, I had a follow-up for Dr. Stoddard.
Okay, Senator Hicks, please.
Yeah, I'm just, I come back and the discussion that we were having about the 76 or the 83 and applicant pool. But based on your recommendation, and I think this is consistent with the recommendations and the discussion we had with Picus and Auden yesterday, until we can actually measure quality teachers by some metric, the assumption that more applicants, we don't have any data that shows that more applicants results in higher quality teachers either. So, before we go down that road, I think we'd have to have a serious discussion about how we're going to measure that in the future as far as that quality. And I think the thing that jumped out to me on that is your data where you showed that there's an uptick in teachers with a master's degrees that are applying, but that doesn't necessarily, based on the literature that you provided, indicate that they're better teachers, but we pay them more just because they have a credential. Again, we don't have that metric to know whether we're getting the bang for the buck for hiring somebody with a master's degree over somebody with a bachelor's. Is that correct?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, that would be my, that's my view of the literature.
Okay, thank you.
Representative Freeman, a quick question, then we're going to take our 10:20 scheduled break.
Just to feed off of what Representative Harshman said, it's just not in Casper. What's happening is particularly with Valley City State is that they spend a lot of time advising students. So students know exactly what they have to do. They know what classes that they have, and those classes are there. Up until recently, the University of Wyoming didn't have a lot of education classes online. And when you had site-based students, especially from the community colleges, it just made sense. I forgot about Western Governors, but I was the advisor to the non-traditional students, and that's all they talked about was getting to Valley City State. They knew what classes that they had, and they oftentimes allowed PhD faculty that were at the community colleges to have classes there if they had enough students that were enrolled. So that's the reason why things are increasing, and community colleges are making that kind of commitments or agreements.
All right.
Senator Kinski, just one real quick thing, and this is something for the committee to consider. I think based on this discussion, it would be, I think, interesting to put together a metric assessment, even if it's just observatory from the districts, is all these graduates that they're getting on the new hires coming in would be to go in there and give us some assessment. Are the ones that are coming out of University of Wyoming better or worse? Are they better than Regis, Northern Colorado? Again, I get trying to grow our own, but I also think that that's something that would be very simple to poll the school districts, put together a simple survey as to rank their new hires that have come out of these universities or online courses as far as quality. getting back and do we really know we're getting quality instruction? Does talent really matter? Maybe we ought to collect some data based on where they're coming from to make a judgment on that.
Thank you. Representative Freeman, we'll pick up with your question after our break. It's 10:20. We're scheduled for a 10-minute break. So let's go ahead and break and we'll be back at 10:30. And I think we still have to hear from Picus and Auden, and we have to still go over the non-teacher salary study as well. I just let folks know, I show that we've got, in addition to the 6 people I can see on video, we've got 21 non-video participants. I've set my screen to just move anybody off that doesn't have their video on. So if you want to talk, you've got to turn your camera on and raise your hand so I know that you're out there and wanting to participate. All right, it's 10:30. We're back from our break, and I think before break, Representative Friedman had a comment or a question for Dr. Stoddard.
It's just a simple question. How many new teachers are hired in Wyoming each year? So when we look at 57.1%, so how many people does that represent? Do you know offhand?
Sorry, had to unmute myself there. Let's see, I can tell you that figure, just 2 seconds here. What do I have there? You know, I don't know that I can tell you that super fast. I pulled that over a couple of years. And so I'd have to send you that number, because that one's pulled over kind of a 4-year period.
Okay, so before we, at 11, we're scheduled for public comment. I don't think we're going to get there. We have another salary study to go and Picus and Aden's comments yet to go, but Senator Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to talk to Dr. Sutter for just a little bit. I don't want to sound like I'm opposed to performance-based salary, but I have some real concerns. First of all, a single test each year, we'd need at least 4 to 5 years, I would think, of data to be able to make good decisions. And I would ask you what your thought is on that. The other is, we need some consistency to the state test, if that's what we're going to use. When we change the state test every 3 years and all of the anchors and the setting points and everything else change, we're sitting there with a new target, and when the target keeps moving, it's very difficult to hit. So I'd just like to know your thoughts on that. I know Arizona at one time, and I don't know whether they still do, have performance-based, so it would be something we could certainly look into. What are your thoughts?
Before we get there, I just want to clarify, if I can, Senator Cost. I didn't hear her recommendation that we make it pay for performance. I think that was a suggestion by one of our colleagues. I think what she said in her study is that we should have some data available so that we know at an aggregate level, at our level, as to whether we're getting performance out of the people that we're hiring, which I think is different than pay for performance. But Dr. Stoddard?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, Senator Cost, I certainly would want to do a lot more kind of thinking before, full on recommending a performance-based pay system. But absolutely, Chairman, I think what you had to say is exactly what I would say. I think you ought to start thinking about, the kind of questions your colleagues are raising and that you've raised yourself, that the chairman's raised, how can you better track teacher quality across the state, and whether that's getting more information about the quality of some of these teacher training programs. Definitely in the focus groups, I heard, I didn't present that because I don't want to single out an individual institution on the basis of a handful of comments, but a couple of places saying, hey, we're not so sure about the quality of this program. Whether it's keeping better records about how many of these positions are being kind of filled with emergency credentials. I think that would be a very easy thing to keep track of, even easier than calculating, how many applications do you have. I think you have a range of metrics, but I do think that moving towards a system, which most states, I think, now have some kind of accountability-based system or some kind of a system where you can at least say, how are different teachers doing in the classroom in terms of student test scores? I agree with you. That's a multi-year undertaking to get into a true performance-based system. I'm not advocating that at this point, but.
So Dr. Stoddard, before I go to Representative Summers, the only thing I had, and this is an opportune moment to make the ask, is without chasing the rabbit of pay for performance, I just am interested in your recommendation that we be able to get some performance data other than, number of subs, those working without a credential, that's fine. But in terms of student outcomes data, what have other states done and what kinds of things might we consider in Wyoming? And I'd like to find if there's a way to leverage off of the data that's already being collected rather than a whole nother system. If you could just briefly in a follow-up, give us some information on what other states have done in that regard. Representative Summers.
Mr. Chairman, I'll pass for the moment. Thank you.
Okay, other questions from joint education or recalibration before we go to Doctors Pikus and Auden on the teacher salary study? Okay, Doctors Pikus and Auden, did you have some follow-up to Dr. Stoddard's presentation?
Mr. Co-Chair, I believe that Representative Summers and you asked us to provide a number for a salary recommendation. And I'm with an actual salary number, which I think was one of the concerns. We have a table that provides that. If Karen enables me to share, I can put that up. And I think probably Dr. Auden will talk a little more about what underlies the numbers that we're doing there. So I will attempt to share that and at the same time turn it over to Alan. And I'll find that table. And
while Larry puts that up, I think I would say that Larry and I don't have a whole lot extra to say. I think Senator Hicks at the beginning of the last Q&A session sort of, and for here just look at teachers, summed it up on teachers. We really don't have data on what it takes to recruit and retain a high quality, effective teacher. So we're stuck. I think we need a different kind of a study, and you need, as part of that study, however it would be done, would be some way to identify teacher effectiveness. So we kind of went with Chris to saying maybe the next best thing that the state could do would be to pick a policy benchmark linking teacher salaries to professional technical workers as comparable workers. And this says 75th, whether it's 75th or 76th. The point here is the teacher at the 75th or 76th is pretty much where the model is right now. And that's in the middle of surrounding states. And I think nationally, is that right, Chris? Okay.
Yeah, nationally it's 77%. So.
Okay, so it's in the same, and the 85th percentile is where Wyoming has been in the past. That's more at the actual teacher salary level. And the caveat that we put in, and we might have been too specific here, would be that if you shifted model salaries to actual salaries, that's an $8,000 increase. And I think the intent of what we wanted to say is if you do that and pick that as the benchmark figure you're trying to kind of fund, because that's a significant increase in not only money for teachers, but in money for the formula, that it should be accompanied with some set of signals that you want more performance out of the system. Otherwise, what you get is the current system at a higher cost level. So whether that's a pay for performance, and there's multiple designs for that, whether that's an accountability system, whether that's giving every school and every district a performance improvement target, whatever it is, I think our general comment is, if you move to that level, and it's really your policy option because we don't have data to say it ought to be at the 80th or 79th, I think that's really in your bailiwick. But if you move to a higher level above current model, it's more money, and we think you should then send a set of signals, pretty strong signals, that you want more student performance out of the system. That would be our generic set of comments.
Co-Chairman Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Drs. Pikus and Auden, thank you for providing me this chart. It's exactly what I wanted. And so thank you for that. But I do want to note, and I'm surprised, Dr. Auden, if you don't know this, that we do have an accountability model, and we do have thresholds within that model for schools. It's a school-based model to tell whether you're meeting expectations, exceeding expectations, or lower than expectations. We don't trip that into a teacher accountability model where you would fire a teacher if she's not meeting expectations. We don't go that far.
Right.
And nor do we go the other way where if you're exceeding expectations, then we're going to pay you more. But we certainly do have an accountability model, and I'm wondering if you've looked at that.
Doctor?
Mr. Co-Chair and Representative Summers, we haven't looked at that. Given the fact that we've sort of taken this position that you should be getting a lot more performance out of the system in terms of the funding you're putting in, my guess would be that if I were sitting in your shoes, I might think of strengthening it.
Senator Rothfuss.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. A couple of questions about the recommendation, Mr. Chairman. First of all, what, getting to your recommendation in your model, recommendation number 10, talent matters. And you're bringing recommendations on what the salaries might want to be for the 75th and 85th percentile. And we lack data of whether or not we're getting a sufficient number of applicants or any correlation between talent and those numbers. How can we have confidence that those numbers achieve your recommendation number 10 that you're providing to us?
Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Rothfuss, you can't.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, separate question, getting to the kind of pay performance model that we've been talking a little bit about on a teacher basis. We spent a number of years, Senator Coe was there, Representative Summers, Representative Harshman, Representative Connolly, I believe, was on all of the, and I think Representative Freeman as well, on the education accountability model, where we were trying originally to put together some sort of pay for teacher performance. And that was really the original intent. And one of the things that we learned during that exercise was that it is very difficult to achieve an individual performance-based pay model while simultaneously implementing what we understood as the priorities of your education model, which is professional learning communities, making sure that you have cooperation, that you've got instructional facilitators, that you've got people working together, because typically the pay for performance type models end up with competition where teachers just want the best students because those best students will end up performing well. You can test that, so it ends up with an overemphasis on testing relative to emphasis on education. We heard that loud and clear. And then we heard that there were a lot of non-core course teachers that would be nearly impossible to evaluate through any type of system. Imagine your art teacher, for example. You know, what's my art test that I objectively give to determine whether the art teacher is successfully teaching art to students, or the orchestra students, you know, are they teaching strings effectively? So I don't see how kind of the suggestion that we need to strengthen an accountability model so that we can more effectively test, weigh the students, so to speak, and understand which teachers are performing and which teachers aren't, honestly, in any way reflects values 1 through 9 in your recommended model. So can you point to anyone who has implemented a teacher effectiveness or a merit-based pay funding model that comports with your model and does it successfully? That's my first question here, and then I'll have a follow-up, Mr. Chairman. Who has done this effectively?
Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Rothfuss, 2 or 3 things. First of all, this is a gigantic issue. That's why I try to sort of back away from it and say, if you're going to put a lot more money in the system, consider, making some stronger statements about performance that you want from the system. But there have been two approaches to this issue of performance pay for teachers. One is more on the economist side. They want to link students to teachers and do value added, and that's how they do it. The other way is you adopt a set of teaching standards. And that's been done inconsistently across the country. But you have standards for math teachers, science teachers. You can have these standards pretty much across all categories of teachers. And then you measure their performance to the set of those standards. And there are tools and techniques that we have to do that. You can get about 4 to 5 performance levels, and you can design it's called kind of measuring pedagogical practice. In the private sector, it's called measuring knowledge and skills. And you can design a salary system where the big pay increases come when you move from performance level 1 to performance level 2, et cetera, et cetera. You probably don't want to go through that. The education system generally doesn't like it. They don't like the value added in terms of performance pay for teachers. And it's very difficult to point to places that have implemented. I think the one place, and maybe Larry, others can help me, where they've had a system in place where there's some data that suggests it's worked, not only to get more effective teachers, but also to improve student performance, is the pay system in Washington, D.C. That was sort of controversial when it started, but my understanding is they continued to keep, it's still in place, and there's evidence that they've been able to pay teachers who produce more learning in their classrooms more money and kind of recruit and retain them. But there aren't a lot of examples of this across the country. It would take a huge effort. But again, without a study that has some measures of teacher effectiveness, you're not going to know what the number is in terms of what average salary level you need to put in place to recruit and retain. The other thing I would recommend, going back to what Chris Stoddard said in her last recommendation, is your districts tend to recruit teachers very regionally. And one of the things that when I ran a project called Strategic Management of Human Capital, we focused on urban districts. But a lot of the urban districts had a teacher quality problem. And when they looked at what they were doing, they realized that they were recruiting a lot of their teachers from low quality supply areas. Their supply chain wasn't very good. So they began to try to identify other areas, other supply areas. And for example, Chicago hadn't been recruiting teachers from the University of Illinois or from the University of Iowa or the University of Wisconsin. And so one of the things that you could think about is a state effort to broaden recruitment strategies beyond the regional, your close-in region, and try to tap flagship universities or flagship teacher training programs in a wider area, not necessarily nationally, although you don't have to hire thousands and thousands of teachers. You just have to find a few more who want to live kind of in the rural area, in your mountain areas, and that could make a very difference. But I would say that would be one other recommendation, a statewide effort to kind of recruit talent in new and different places.
Senator Rothfuss, you had a follow on?
Yep, thank you, Mr. Chairman. All right, I appreciate those comments, Dr. Auden, and I guess the key ask I would have is if we are going to suggest exploring kind of more rigorous standards, more rigorous understanding, this is all supposed to be data driven. And I would like to see data that shows that those types of systems, or if we were to adopt a system like that, it would lead to better outcomes and lead to the objectives in 1 through 10. So if that's out there, I want to see that. But if it's not, honestly, that's an awful lot of work, an awful lot of turmoil for something that we haven't seen demonstrated to work in terms of the teacher effectiveness merit pay. I need to see studies instead of anecdotes, and this seems like a good idea. On the side of recruitment, now I do think we've got a strong idea there. Recruiting nationally might be a challenge because we are below the national average, but we're still above the regional average. So I think looking at Dr. Stoddard and your suggestions there with regard to recruitment certainly makes sense. And we can look at some basic factors that will probably tend to indicate success in terms of teacher performance. But again, it would be wonderful if we could actually get some data and understood better what is a good teacher when you're recruiting it. What determines, which factors when you're recruiting determine, all right, this is going to be a great career teacher in the state of Wyoming versus these factors really don't make much difference. So if there is any literature on that, if there are any key indicators that dictate performance of highly effective teachers based on their graduation or anything like that, I think it would be excellent. So I want more studies and less anecdotes on both of these points if we're going to seriously consider them and as means of accomplishing the objectives that are set out in the points 1 through 10. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Rothfuss. Before I go to Representative Summers and Senator Cost, I just remind folks we have a whole nother pay study to go, as well as public comment. Representative Summers.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate that. Dr. Auden, my question goes back to the contract days. Right now we're at 185 and I don't know that you guys have made a recommendation on that, but one way we can cheapen things up a bit, we could lower our contract days and reduce our salary a bit. So just your thoughts on that whole idea of, Colorado's at 160. There's places in the middle of that before you get to Wyoming. So and if you don't want to do that now and you want to think on it some, I'm fine with that, and you could get back.
Doctor, now or later?
Well, Mr. Co-Chair and Mr. Co-Chair, I don't know if we have a position on that now or later. I mean, Larry may want to jump in, but if the question was if you reduce the number of days, reduce salaries, I'm not quite sure where that gets you. So, I mean, I looked at those numbers to say generally everybody's pretty close to the same. Some of the specifics may be different, but pretty much everybody's got a 36-week school year. They tend to go to school for 6.5 hours, the kids and faculty. I mean, so, and you've got a lot of districts in Wyoming that have shifted to a 4-day school week. So for kids, and so that I don't think we have expertise on that, Larry. Do we?
No, I don't. Except I would say that the model, the general evidence-based model, does recommend on a standard 5-day school week the 185 days that are in the contract. So that's part of. I mean that's part of what the evidence-based model says. So to answer directly Co-Chair Summers' question, yes, we have talked about that. If you reduce that and reduced the pay because there were fewer days, at least the word we hear from the districts is that they're looking for us to pay to go the opposite direction, and that seems to be what the concern is. So I don't know whether that. It would depend on what your goals were and what your purpose was in pay levels.
Senator Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll make this brief so that we can get moving. I also would like to see the data that Senator Rothfuss was talking about, but I wanted to make sure it's data that's connected to similarity in populations and all. We can talk about the Rock Springs Trona mines, and they tried bringing people from West Virginia and all to fill their vacancies. They had up to 140 vacancies that they couldn't get filled. People would come out for a year and then they would leave because this is a totally different world than what they're accustomed to with populations and everything else. So large urban areas, I don't think would be good data. So hopefully if you can get that data, I'd like to see it to somewhat match to our location as far as the rural and all, and not so close to large cities and all that they have much more social aspects and everything that we don't have. Thank you.
Anything further from joint education or recalibration committee members before we go on to the non-teacher pay study? Nothing further. Then Dr. Stoddard, the floor is yours.
Okay, let's see. Is that sharing? Are you seeing my non-teacher?
We are indeed.
Okay, excellent. All right, so hopefully this will go a little faster because comparisons of non-teachers are a little bit easier. So, so I'm going to focus on 5 general categories here. First, looking at school administration, then looking at professional staff, then clerical staff, other classified staff, and then aides. So similarly, I'm also going to look at salaries in comparison with comparable professionals, again, looking at this for the occupational employment survey. And I have a couple of different ways of slicing that I'll get into as we get into that. There are a few occupations, you know, when we're talking about nurses, for example, it's really easy to look at what's the wage for nurses in teaching versus non-teaching. Some occupations don't have as clear of a match, you know, teaching aides, a school principal, obviously those are a little different. So I'll talk about that. I've used in this report, rather than trying to do a whole range of numbers, I've just gone with 37 weeks with a few exceptions that we'll talk about. You know, there are some occupations where the weeks of work is more full year. But for some of them, you know, school nurses or librarians, I've gone with 37 weeks. And then using the same data that I talked to you about before, I've gone with 47 weeks for the private sector.
Mr. Chairman, sorry to interrupt. Dr. Stoddard, could you go full screen with your?
Yes,
we're seeing your entire computer screen.
Oh, I apologize.
So it's probably the screen share feature that you might want to shift on.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry for the interruption.
You didn't want us looking at your checkbook balance?
Yeah, well, you know, let's see, let's try it this way. Is that better?
Yeah, there you go.
Okay. Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to keep it so I can see you guys and see what I'm doing here. Okay, so so I have and so I'll go through the relative salaries and then talk about turnover rates. Let's see. So there are several different comparisons, and actually maybe I'll talk about this a little bit more when we get to that slide. So let me start with administrators here. So again, we've got kind of the funding model, average, and then the actual average. So for superintendents, assistant superintendents, business managers, there's a relatively large difference between the actual average salary and the funding model. For principals, it's a little closer, that difference. And so here I'm going to compare then the salaries in the schools with salaries in other occupations. So I've got a bunch of columns here, so let me talk this through. So you've seen in my report the first 3 columns. So the first column here is showing in the Occupational Employment Statistics Survey in K through 12 schools, what's the average salary in all management occupations. So these are the occupational titles that the Bureau of Labor Statistics uses. So a chief executive, for example, that's going to be your school superintendent. The next column shows you what salaries look like in all of Wyoming for that same occupational category. The following column, which you saw in the report that I gave you, is all public sector workers in Wyoming, but taking out the whole education sector. So this takes out, this third column is a column that the Bureau of Labor Statistics provides. So these are new estimates that they're starting to provide. In previous years when I've done this, I haven't been able to use that column. But what is important to emphasize is this takes out public K through 12. It also takes out the university system. So it's taking out the University of Wyoming. The following column is a new column based on some questions that I got by email after I sent out the report. So the Department of Workforce Services worked with me to get estimates of state and local employment, taking out just K through 12 schools. So in order to take out the K through 12 schools, I had to do some weighted averages. The problem is the Bureau of Labor Statistics suppresses, this is maybe getting into the weeds, but they suppress the number of employees. They round it to the nearest 10. So when I'm calculating these averages, they're not going to be quite right. And that's why I didn't do this last column. The reason that that matters is that when we're looking at administrators, and it's really only administrators, the University of Wyoming changes the averages a lot. So if you look at these chief executives, for example, when you look at K through 12 schools, there's the 147,000. There are 40. That's not, you guys know, that's not exactly the number of state superintendents or school superintendents, but that's rounded. That's relatively high in comparison with chief executives in all industries in Wyoming, which is the 130,000 number. That's the number that Pikus and Auden are going to use when they talk about kind of the market-based salary figure. It's that 130,000. Just to compare, how does that look for chief executives who work for state and local government, excluding the University of Wyoming? You get a pretty low number. And so that number was one that was called into question, I think, in some email correspondence. If you look at state and local and now put back in the University of Wyoming, that number goes up a lot. You can see that's a difference of, I don't know exactly how many people, but basically 10 people. You guys probably know how much the president of the University of Wyoming makes. I think that was a public number. I looked it up. Top university administrators are kind of competed for nationally. There are about 10 of those folks that really change that average. So my recommendation was to use this all industries number when we're looking at chief executives. But for many of the other numbers that we present, I'm going to use this third column as being the market. Let's look at other public sector workers. Anyhow, I hope that's not too confusing. I'm trying to be perfectly transparent here so that this is really clear to everybody exactly what I'm doing. So basically what my view is then is that when we're looking at kind of these management occupations, that folks in the schools are paid relatively well compared to their market alternatives. That's a little different when we look at principals. So principals right now, I've given you here the funding model and then the actual salary. So right now you're sitting at the funding model for elementary school principals at about $85,000. Currently, principals in Wyoming are paid roughly $98,000. The funding model, if you were to rank principal salaries relative to other salaries in the nation, that would put Wyoming close to the bottom. So that would rank you at 38th. Your actual principal salaries put you at 22nd. So, when we talked about teachers before, teachers were really well paid in comparison with teachers in the region. Principals, on the other hand, are not as well paid. You're right in the middle of everybody in terms of actual salaries, and your model salaries are pretty low in comparison to the nation. So I view principal salaries as being low relative to the market.
Just Mr. Chairman.
Please, Co-Chairman Summers.
Mr. Chairman, I'm sorry, but I don't want to have her find this slide again. So if our rank with actual salaries was, okay, I think I'm seeing it. The model salary, our rank is 38. Is that correct?
That's correct. That's correct. So that puts you close to the bottom. So 38 out of 50.
Okay,
so,
and then do you have a soup one like this as well?
A superintendent one, I don't, because superintendents aren't broken out. So in the occupational employment statistics, they give you a principal occupation. They don't give you a superintendent one. It's just a chief executive. I could get Department of Workforce Services to run that number for me for K through 12, but I can't get it for the other states. So
Thank
for
you.
superintendents, I can only kind of compare it to what chief executives are making for other industries. I can tell you that the superintendent pay relative to model pay, there's a pretty big gap for superintendents, a much smaller gap for principals.
Thank you.
So if there aren't more questions about administrators, I'll move on then and talk about professional staff. So for administrators, I didn't do the weeks of work adjustment. I talk about that some in the report. Many, certainly superintendents and many principals have longer weeks of work. But when we get into professional staff here again, I'm using the 37 weeks for the teaching sector and the 47 weeks for the non-teaching sector. And so I've given you this for school psychologists, for social workers, for school counselors, and then obviously this doesn't apply to schools, but looking at this for non-school, kind of similar mental health employees, giving you those figures. So again, here I view both it definitely in terms of weekly pay. These professional staff kind of on this kind of psychology counseling side appear to be well in line with the market on weeks of pay, adjusted for weeks of pay significantly above. The one exception would be looking at school psychologists in comparison with psychologists that are practicing outside of schools, but in the public sector, that they're relatively better paid. Whoops. Then looking at other professional staff, if we look at registered nurses and speech pathologists, that's a little different. So there, the weekly pay is kind of in line with the market. The annual pay is below. Librarians definitely better paid within the school system. Looking at computer network specialists, again, in terms of weekly pay, well in line or a little above, but annual salary is a little lower. Looking at secretarial and clerical staff now, again, basically in terms of weekly salary, we're seeing highly competitive salaries in schools in comparison with both all other sectors and in comparison with public sector work. And then other classified staff, the one place here that I see that there was kind of a big difference and that I sort of had a hard time, kind of wrapping the data around this. In the funding model for operations and maintenance staff, the funding model salary is $34,000. Actual salary is somewhat lower. If I look at maintenance and repair workers, what gets reported in the occupational employment statistics, it's a lot higher, both for janitors and for maintenance and repair workers. I'm not sure why there is such a big discrepancy there. So if I look at what districts are reporting in the WDE files, that's low in comparison with the market. But if I look at what's reported in the OES files, that's higher. So, and bus drivers, school districts reported a lot of difficulty hiring bus drivers. The pay looks like it's in line, but I definitely did hear that from school districts that they're having difficulty both with maintenance and repair workers and with bus drivers. And then in terms of aides, this is one that's really difficult to kind of compare across sectors because it's fairly different. These are supervisory aides here. So actual salaries are about $3,000 more than the model salary. How does that compare with the market? There's not really a good exactly market comparison. So I put up kind of childcare workers and personal home care aides. Again, if we're adjusting for weeks of work, we'd get, sort of competitive salaries, but these are kind of different occupations. So then I'll just turn and look at what turnover looks like. So what I've done for administrators is to exclude individuals with a teaching component kind of across the board. I am looking at full-time workers so that we're kind of comparing apples to apples. I'm not let's see, let me rephrase that. I'm counting someone as an exit if they switch districts. So I'm a principal in one school, I move to a different school, I would count that as an exit. But if they stay within the same school, so like I give the example here, Jane, she's an assistant principal. Next year she becomes a teacher. I'd call that also an exit, but if she becomes a principal, that's still within the administrator category. So I wouldn't count that as an exit. Hopefully that's clear. Why is this not advancing? Okay. So here's what exit rates look like going back to 2009. So basically what we've seen is kind of, whoops. Sorry, my computer's glitchy here. Are you seeing that okay now? I'm gonna assume that's good.
Yep, we're seeing it fine.
Okay. So this is going to be what we're going to see kind of across these graphs, kind of an increase in turnover, particularly when we're looking at aides and classified staff. When we're looking at professional or office support or administrators, those turnover rates have increased maybe modestly, but hardly at all. Sorry. For some reason, my computer is having this lag. Okay, here we go. So here's for administrators. The bottom row is just looking at the average administrator. The top red set of dots is looking at a new administrator. So that's why you don't observe them in the first 2 years, because I have to see if they were an administrator in the previous years. So people who are new to a position have a slightly higher turnover rate than people who are more experienced, but that turnover rate is quite low, about 10%, sort of in line with the turnover rate for teachers, as you recall. If we're looking at professional staff, so again, the registered nurses, the school counselors, slightly higher turnover rate, but again, pretty stable through this period. Maybe a slight uptick in the last 2 years if we're looking at a kind of new nurses, new school counselors, but that's not very many years where we see that kind of uptick. So still within kind of the range of what we've seen in the past. If we're looking at secretarial and clerical workers, there's kind of, I would say, a modest increase, but again, very low turnover rates, so close to 10%. Here with the maintenance and operation workers, especially for new employees in those categories, there's an increase there. And again, supervisory aides, what I mentioned before, their turnover rates have increased more. So going from about 10% to about 20%, it's been sort of a steady increase throughout this whole period, and definitely is higher when we're looking at new aides. And then this last slide is just showing what's the right turnover rate. So here we can actually look at other industries and say, what does turnover look like in education as compared to other industries? You've seen a lot of rates that are in that kind of 10 to 15%, for aides going up to about 20%. How does that compare to other industries? Well, basically the education industry, and this is just for Wyoming here, you've got a turnover rate on average of about 12%. That's been pretty consistent since 2010. As I mentioned, a little increase, but not much lower than nearly every other sector, unless you're looking at government sector jobs. So looking at public administration, you have a low turnover rate, but if you're looking at any of these other professions, you have a much higher turnover rate. So the following kind of summarizes my recommendations, which you'll see, again, kind of feeding into what Pikus and Auden are going to present. So in terms of looking at administrators, if we compare actual salary and model salary, many other central office administrators are 10 to 25% above the model, principals about 15% above the model. Administrators, as I mentioned, are more in line with the market if we're looking at central office administrators, but principals, I would say, are looking lower. So, right in the middle of the nation, which I guess you could say is in line with the market if you want to be in the middle, but compared to what teachers look like, kind of below where you're at. Psychologists, counselors, social workers, librarians. I should have mentioned this. Those are all paid using the teacher salary schedule, but since we can compare them to other occupations, I'm just letting you know. But those all, the actual salaries tend to be in line with market weekly salaries. And then if we look at other groups, so if we look at secretarial and clerical workers, those, if we're looking at the model salaries, those are a little bit above, the actual salaries a little bit above the model, but in line with the market. Operations and maintenance, that's the one that was a little bit tricky because there's this difference between what districts are reporting and what the way the occupational employment statistics is classifying those jobs. So my perception was that those are below market, but with the acknowledgement that it's a little bit noisier. Aides, again, are being paid above the market, kind of in line with the market for weekly wages, but there has been this increase in turnover. So as a whole, actual average salaries tend to be higher with the model than the model. For most of these, though, we're seeing stuff that's in line with the market if we adjust for weeks of work. The one thing I think to watch for is the increase in turnover among aides, although, you know, if we're comparing that to the market, turnover in education is really low compared to other industries, unless you're looking at public administration. So that concludes my presentation on non-teacher salaries, and I'm happy to take other questions about that before turning it over to Larry and Alan.
All right, Senator Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Dr. Stoddard, one of the concerns I have is our technology people, the people working with computers and all. Is there any way that could have been separated out, or has it been, or did I just miss that? Because I know that in the quote other world, they can make considerably more money in a lot of times.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, and
I thought I saw it in there somewhere.
yeah, it is. And I'm trying to go back, but again, my computer's being sort of glitchy. So give me just a second. So if you're looking at computers, so I included them under the professional staff. So this is for computer network specialists. I used that occupational category in the OES because in the K through 12 sector, that had the biggest number. There are like 3 or 4 other kind of more specialized computer occupations that tend to be higher paid, but you don't have as many of those in K through 12. So I think these are probably the people that are, you know, working within a school, and you may have some folks kind of, again, central office that are different, but within the school, that's where I have the $53,000 number, looking at the staffing files and how does that compare to other sectors. You know, on a weekly basis, that's in line. But like I said, there are these kind of smaller, more specialized computer occupations where there aren't the same numbers, and I didn't pull that, but I certainly could if you need it.
Senator Cost, did you have a follow-up before I go to Representative Summers?
I did, Mr. Chairman. Thank you real quickly. And the weekly salary, they're usually year round, 12 months out of the year. So I was just wondering if that's considered in there, or did you use the number of days that school's in session?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Senator Cost, no, I used the 37 weeks for that. So I could certainly make a correction on that. I apologize for missing that.
Chairman Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And it's actually on this sheet 2 above, and that's one of the things I hear most about is speech pathologists. And you can see the disconnect here. And I'm sorry, I may have missed what your final recommendation was on speech pathologists.
So, Mr. Chairman, and Representative Summers, the speech pathologist, I believe, and maybe Matt can weigh in if I'm wrong on this. I believe they're also paid on the teacher salary schedule. So I didn't make a recommendation for them specifically because they kind of get rolled under with teachers. You're absolutely right that their annual salary is lower. I again use that 37 weeks. So, so someone could correct me if the speech pathologists are working, year round instead of the 37 weeks. But on a weekly basis, their salaries are more in line.
All right.
Mr. Chairman, just a follow-up.
Yes, sir.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And I think the challenge is the small pool. You're not investigating speech pathologists like you are teachers, as far as the pool of them and pressures on that position. So I don't think for the purposes of salary you can throw them into the same pool as teachers and say that that's the same thing. All indications are it's really hard to get speech pathologists. And so I think it's funny that that their staffing data wages is low. I find that interesting, but I still think they're hard to get. So I'm just hoping maybe you take a look at that, or maybe Picus and Auden in their one pager, maybe they have them listed separately so we can see what they are on that as well.
Matthew?
Mr. Chairman, generally the speech pathologists are reimbursed under your special education model. So, but they are generally on a teacher contract. So I just wanted to make some of that clarification as well.
All right. Does that help, Representative?
Thank you. It does help some.
Okay. Other questions? Representative Brown, welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I apologize if this question has been previously answered, but one of the things that I look at when I see this comparative to the different school districts is a total compensation package, not just the typical staffing on it. And so when I look at registered nurses, as you show here, number one, I wanted to ask on that, is that the 37 weeks as well? And then before you even answer that, I'll just get my other follow-up out of the way. When you look at this, is that a total compensation package when you look at the 602 staffing data across the board? Is this what all the school districts report out on for whether they pay their health insurance for their employees, whether the employees pay a portion of that? Those are the types of things that I think kind of get skewed in this data on a regular basis. So if you could answer those two, that would be helpful for me. Thank you.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Representative, no, this is just the salary data. So the occupational employment statistics also only report salary. It doesn't report health insurance. It doesn't report retirement contributions, any of that. So this is just comparing salaries to salaries. There's not good data on retirement and healthcare benefits, by occupation, for the either nationally or within Wyoming. So you'll have to kind of make that mental adjustment yourself. This is just trying to compare salaries to salaries.
And then just if I could get the answer on the registered nurses, is that at 37 weeks on the teacher staffing as well, or is that
yes, correct? Yeah, so that first column there, I'm dividing always by 37, and then the other columns I'm dividing by 47. So when we're out of the K through 12 sector, I'm assuming 47 hours a week. Within the education sector, I'm assuming 37 hours a week.
Okay, before I go to Drs. Picus and Auden, did anybody else of Joint Education or Recalibration have any further questions for Dr. Stoddard on the non-teacher study? All right, Drs. Picus and Auden.
Thank you, Mr. Co-Chair. I will put that table back up so that I'll need permission to share first, and then I'll put it back up. And then we can, I think what you'll find is that our recommendations generally took the numbers that Dr. Stoddard provided. As soon as it still keeps yelling, now it's letting me share. So I will find it and send it up to view. There it is. Okay, I believe you now should have the table with the salaries that I presented to you before. And I think if you look at this, you'll see that in most instances we've used with a little bit of rounding, the salary numbers that were in Dr. Stoddard's recommendation data that she presented to you just a moment ago. There's, I think, 2 places where you'll see some differences or potentially surprises. One is, as I said, with the school computer technician, where the average FTE weighted average in the model is almost 50,000, and our recommendation is 46,700, and we're talking about different things. In Dr. Stoddard's data, she's providing for data, computer technician executives or people who operate the program or the IT department. Those would be in the central office in our model. And the people that we're funding here would be individuals who repair the computers and do the work in the schools or in the computer repair shop, provide those sorts of things. So we're not exactly comparing the same thing. The second one where you see a small difference is in custodians and groundskeepers. This is a function of a discovery that I think we made a week or 2 ago. Matt, remind me when we did. In the model currently, groundskeepers are funded at the same salary level as office maintenance workers. It had always been our intent that grounds workers would be funded at the same level of custodians. And so our recommendation for salaries assumes that that's the case. I've tracked back through the model since 2005 when we first did it. And the model has been consistent throughout and different than our intent. I don't have an answer for that other than we found the documentation from that we provided, put together with the staff in 06. And as I've certified and looked at the model since, I think we've just not looked that closely at it because there have been no changes to that part of the model other than changing the number of them at one point recently. So other than that, the other numbers represent the numbers that come out of Dr. Stoddard's data.
Thank you. Chairman Summers.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. So, Dr. Pikus, I guess kind of back to that specialist that I mentioned before. Did you just leave it in teachers? I forget, is it? Yeah.
Mr. Co-Chair and Representative Summers, I believe we were talking about speech pathologists.
Correct, speech pathologists. Thank you.
So districts typically pay speech pathologists on a teacher salary schedule, as Matt Wilmarth mentioned earlier. And we don't actually have that specifically in the model because they're also special education staff, and they're therefore funded through the special education reimbursement model and not part of the general model for general education. So what districts are paying them isn't affected by the model. It's affected by their salary schedule, which is affected by the model, but we don't have specific data or a recommendation for that. That would be in the special education work.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions or comments for Drs. Pikus and Odden on the non-teacher salary study? Okay, not seeing anything else from, Dr. Odden.
Yes.
You want to offer comment on Dr. Pikus's?
Yes.
You can ask me a question, apparently.
Mr. Co-Chair, I think one of the things that we should say is that we recommended moving towards using an overall average salary for all these positions rather than a beginning salary with adjustments for education, experience, and responsibility. So that's another major change in this. It would simplify it as I think a lot of people would argue that the education and experience adjustments really aren't adjustments that are linked to effectiveness. And so it would just simplify it and make it more straightforward to just use averages.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Representative Summers.
So, Mr. Chairman, thank you. And so if you, if the state was heavy to experienced teachers, then this would likely reduce the I guess, the reimbursement to districts. Kind of flesh that out a little bit and try to explain to me what the impact of what you're doing is over what we currently do. And so, and I know it would vary depending upon that mix of experience within the state. And perhaps we just have to have Matt run that in a separate model to see, okay, if we do it as average salaries, it's X. If we do it with experience, it's Y. Is that the best way to understand this?
Mr. Co-Chair, I can, if with your permission, for about a minute or two, historical discussion of where that is and why we've made the recommendation, I think might be helpful. The model, the previous MAP model, which was in existence before we started recalibrating in 2005, used the logic of I think the argument that Jim Smith and Jim Guthrie put together was that over the short term, a district didn't have control over the distribution of its teachers in terms of experience. And they used Professor Michael Wolkoff from University of Rochester to estimate the amount that's provided for a year of education or unit of education or a year of additional experience. In 2005, we employed Professor Wolkoff to re-estimate those numbers. Matt will correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure he told me that those numbers have not changed since 2005. So that the estimates are substantially out of date. In every other state, we have always just used one other change that we made is it originally started by using the average teacher salary in the model and then adjusting districts amounts for teacher salaries upward and downward based on how they fit in the experience and education continuum. And of course, districts that got a negative number didn't like it. I was actually the person who did the work for MAP to reprogram that in the model initially, and we moved it to the base salary, which we've always continued to use, so nobody got a negative adjustment, if you will. In the meantime, those adjustments haven't changed, so that their impact is less than they once were. We think it makes much more sense for understanding to use the average salary, so you know what the average districts are getting, not the base salary. And then we've used that in every other state we've worked in. We've not made those adjustments in other places. My sense is I don't think we've actually run the exact numbers to see what the difference in each district would receive is. But by this point in time, because of the numbers haven't changed and the averages have moved up, I believe that it would have a relatively small effect on a very few districts. And only to the extent that they've had a substantial change over time in the distribution of teachers, which is probably not very likely. It just sort of ebbs as it goes along. So I assume, Matt, we could figure out a way to run those numbers, but it would be probably a very small difference.
Thank you. And so Matt, maybe Matt, follow up, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, no,
Okay.
I see Matt's on the screen now. Go ahead, Matt.
Yeah, Mr. Chairman and Chairman Summers, the recommendations are a combination of salary, but also, as we'll hear later today, regional cost adjustment. And so we can certainly run a pure comparison of current model weighted average salary for each, or current model average salary for each district compared to the average salary recommended by the consultants, compare that without any regional cost adjustments. But what further plays into these recommendations is the regional cost adjustment. So I think it's a better reflection to look at total average salaries after you apply regional cost adjustment as well.
Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Matt, I don't disagree, but in order for me to clearly see the effect of one thing, I want to see what is the difference between average and base salary when you run it through the model. And I'm mostly interested in the total number, not necessarily the difference in each district. I just want to see what that effect is. What does it actually do? What does it actually mean dollars and cents wise?
Mr. Chairman, I'll attempt. Again, the model uses a regional cost adjustment to further adjust these salaries. And so,
Mr. Chairman, just use just use our current RCA, which we currently have, and not a new updated RCA, and then I can look at it through that lens.
Okay.
Thank you.
So before I go to Senator Cost, I just a quick one for Dr. Stoddard as a follow-up item, and you don't need to answer it now, but I'd like to see, we talked about teacher salary premiums and are we getting, pay for performance? I'd like to see that on the superintendents. There's a substantial premium there. And if other states have said, we're holding districts accountable, I'd like to see if there's a model from other states that says, let's see if we're really getting what we're paying for there. And the same thing on the principals, although the salary differential is not as big there. Arguably, the principals have a huge impact. They're the middle managers in this whole deal. They really, the pressure's on them. They've got to perform. And then if you have anything, I'd like to see size data. The average size of a school in Wyoming where a principal is supervising staff versus these other states. And especially on superintendents, there's some school districts in other states that just, there's superintendents getting salaries for managing districts that I think as large as our whole state. I don't know, but I'd like to try and get some idea as to if we're paying somebody $180,000, how does that compare to, looks like Representative Nicholas is getting some tutoring on how to run his computer there. So with that, I'll turn it over to Senator Cost.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. First of all, with the Dr. Picus's salary suggestions, central office, are those figured on 12 months or are those figured on the same as the others? They're figured on 12. And the second question, and I guess it's more of a concern than a question, is with door security, camera observations, and all of the other security stuff that we have along with the phone systems and the computers in these schools, that tech salary looks very difficult to get many people that are very qualified to be able to do the work. I just wonder if all that was taken into account when you guys made the decision on that salary for those people, because they're not just repairing a computer in a classroom and being done, for the majority of them anyway.
Mr. Co-Chair, Senator Cost, the salary recommendations are based on the amount of time that each employee would be employed to work in the school district. You'll notice, for example, the school secretary and the school clerical are two different. One represents a year-round job and one a 9-month job, and the others are similarly considered in that way. In terms of the computer technicians, again, this is a salary for people who would be doing the actual repair work. And we understand it to be a wage that would be competitive with the outside. I would anticipate that on some of those particularly sophisticated school security systems, they more than likely come with their own maintenance and warranty contracts for people to repair those systems rather than to try to have school district staff, although I don't know the details of those, but that would make, I would think, the most sense in terms of trying to operate a system like that. That's not something that's commonly placed in most of the rest of the city or town where a school district is located. And so these are really the cost of the person who actually goes in and, in theory, the help of the person who was helping Representative Nicholas if he was having a mechanical problem with his computer. And the cost of the person to run the IT department would be assumed in the director's line on the central office part of the formula that we talked about last time.
Senator Cost.
Just a quick follow-up. Again, remembering that we are very rural, very frontier. These districts are very isolated. A lot of the districts rely on their tech people. not to just repair a computer, but to do a lot of this other. And as far as getting assistance by somebody from somewhere else, a lot of times that's a long ways away and it's very difficult to get. So I just wonder if that maybe needs a little look at it. But anyway, thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, anyone else before we go to public comment? Anyone else? All right, we'll open it up to public comment. I do want to make one observation about public comment. You'll see that we have public comment on the 2 studies. And then again at 4 p.m., it'd probably be more like 6, but we again open it up for comment on the K-12 salary study as well as the RCA and the ECA. And the reason for that, as you know, is the salaries are impacted significantly by the RCA. So with that, I'm going to open it up for public comment. Staff tells me they have between 1 and 6 people to comment, and we're not sure how many folks are going to want to comment just on these 2 studies, or how many folks might want to defer their comment until we get to the portion of the study where we look at the RCA as well. So we've got somebody here. Karen or Matt, how many folks do we have for public comment at this point?
Mr. Chairman, right now we have 2 that I have let into the room. We have Mr. Kendakaria and Mr. Brian Farmer that are have just been entered into the room for this morning.
All right, thank you. Ken, welcome. Oh, wait. Dr. Auden?
To step out for a minute, but I just wanted to make a comment that in the model and in the funding model, this is to Senator Cost comments. The IT director for a district is in the central office, and that's a much more skilled position. And the salary for that's been put in the model, which isn't indicated here, is the average between the assistant superintendent and the business manager. So it would be 95,000. So I think and the school computer technicians are just they load programs onto school computers, academic programs, et cetera, et cetera. So the jobs are totally different. One is a much more skilled position, network supervisor, basically, and the other one is loading and doing short fixes of computers in schools. So we think, I just want to make sure that people knew that there were, and that's sort of buried here, that there was a different one for a different salary for the network supervisor.
Senator Cost, were you raising your hand again?
Yes, I was, Mr. Chairman. A brief comment to Dr. Auden. I appreciate that because that does clear that up. A lot of the librarians are those technicians that do that work nowadays. But within the central staff of the technician, there's also their assistants in there. Do you have any provisions for what their salaries would be in relationship to the work that they're doing? Because a lot of these districts have definitely more than one that are taking care of all of that. It's a heavy lift.
Mr. Co-Chair and Senator Cost, I think the answer to that, I'd have to go look at some details, but is that the central office staffing is specified with IT directors. And then in bigger districts that have assistant IT directors, as well as many other positions, that's really up to, all the numbers are prorated up from a certain district size. So that it allows them to have assistants and other kinds of people, but that's not specified in the model at that higher level.
All right, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Farmer and then to Mr. DeCaria. And I'm going to step away for a minute, Chairman Summers.
Thank you. Please continue, Brian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brian Farmer, Wyoming School Boards Association. Mr. Chairman, I want to really just confine my comments to one specific topic, and that is what is it like to hire a superintendent in Wyoming? A few years ago, former Dean of the College of Education, Ray Reutzel, talked to legislators about a national teacher shortage and the concerns he had over the national teacher shortage. And certainly that persists today. But I think what we see now is evidence of that national teacher shortage impacting principals, the building administrators, and the superintendents as district administrators. Mr. Chairman, I'm a member of the National Alliance of Superintendent Searchers, NAS, and so I work with folks from across the country who hire superintendents for local school districts. I myself have been involved in over 40 superintendent transitions, and so I think I have a pretty good perspective on what it takes to hire superintendents in Wyoming. And I can say that we are seeing on average now about 7 transitions per year. There are certainly some years where we're hitting double digits in the number of superintendents who change in Wyoming. And there are some years where we only have maybe 3 to 5 transitions per year. But just in these last few years, we are seeing a drastic reduction in applications. Now, that's certainly not because of how recruitment practices happen. We utilize those same best practices that are used across the country. As a matter of fact, Wyoming does more than what other folks do in their recruitment for superintendent candidates.
Brian?
Yes, sir.
Brian, so I don't forget what I want to ask you on something you just said, because I won't be able to remember that long your data, but you talk about transitions. So, and maybe you can clarify this a little bit. So oftentimes a superintendent position comes open in a district, and that district hires a superintendent from another district. And so you've had 2 transitions, but maybe only one of those is a movement out of state. And if you don't have it, I think it would be good data to have is how many transitions are we seeing, and what is the trend of superintendent either retirements but more importantly, movements out of state of superintendents. So are we seeing superintendents moving out of state or changing jobs versus retirements, or just a shift among districts? Because if we're really seeing a trend line of superintendents that are just flat quitting the work, I think that's important to know.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I don't have the specific data in front of me to generally respond to your question. In recent years, most of the transitions we see are more related to retirements. It's only been in recent years that we've started seeing Wyoming superintendents leaving Wyoming for better paying jobs in other states. That used to be quite the rarity, and we are seeing that is happening now, not in great numbers, but it is happening where Wyoming superintendents are finding better paying jobs at not substantially larger districts, but certainly they have been larger districts out of state. And as far as the number of movements from one district within the state to other districts within the state, again, that does happen, but the numbers are quite low. That is not the primary reason for a transition of a superintendency. The large portion of that in recent years has been retirements. And I guess, Mr. Superintendent, or I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman, I have superintendents on the brain here. The reason that I talk about this is what I've observed as I've worked with districts in hiring. And so one of the first questions we ask them is, what do you think you want to offer for a salary? Now, they know what they've offered the outgoing superintendent, and we do a market analysis. We work with them to determine what might be appropriate salaries based on what other districts within the state with similar size are paid, based on any demographic changes that they may have. And of course, education years of experience are factors that matter as well. I will say that I've observed a recent trend of decreasing salaries. Again, as you see some of those very veteran superintendents who are leaving that had higher salaries, many districts are hiring a new superintendent with a lower salary. But the thing that does concern me is the drastic reduction in numbers of applicants and to some degree quality of applicants. We used to see multiple highly qualified candidates. We are now seeing that most superintendent searches do have more than one qualified, highly qualified candidate. But I can tell you the most candidates who qualified that I've ever seen in a search in Wyoming was somewhere in the mid-30s. That's the highest. You don't see tons of people applying for these jobs. Now, of course, what you really need is you need the one good one. You're only going to hire one, so you need the one good one. But it's a challenge, and it's becoming harder and harder to find good people for these positions. So I think that the compensation has to be considered as a part of that package. Certainly the job that they do, when we compare that as Dr. Stoddard has against other CEOs, you run as a superintendent in Wyoming, you run anywhere from a $3 million operation to over a $200 million operation. And if you're accounting for capital construction, some of those budgets hit $300 million. Over 2,000 employees in our largest districts. Even if you compare that with hospital administrator CEO type positions, our superintendents are not in the same range as those other employers running similar sized operations. Now, I will just say that one anecdote that I can share with you that absolutely blew me away is I recently saw data for superintendent salaries in Michigan. A colleague of mine shared that data. They went to extensive pains to collect salaries in Michigan. And I thought there's, got to be the big salaries are coming from their biggest districts. But the truth of the matter was that Detroit was probably top 10, top 15. It was not number one. Number one on their list was a district the size of Wyoming districts, right around that 2,500 sort of range. And so conditions are going to be different from state to state. Different factors will impact it. Certainly, we know that we tend to have better superintendent salaries than Montana. But again, trend-wise, I don't see applicants coming from Idaho like we used to see. That's a recent change from what we've seen in our trends. We don't see as many applicants coming from Colorado, Nebraska, South Dakota as we used to see. So those are just anecdotal observations. I don't have hard data to share with you, but it is concerning to me because as of today, I know that there will be a minimum of 7 transitions in the superintendency in this state next year. That's because there's 7 that have already said we're going to have a change. And I know that number is going to increase. And so I just share that that's a concern for the school boards who are hiring those administrators, And certainly that's a concern that parallels that national teacher shortage. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. I see Senator Ellis has joined us. Senator Ellis, did you have something for Mr. Farmer?
Briefly, Mr. Chairman, and I don't want to belabor the point. I know we're coming up on the noon hour. I've been listening all morning, and I did have a question, and it's for anyone who might want to take a stab at it. But Wyoming did a wage gap study a number of years ago, and one of the discrepancies you see in education isn't on teacher to teacher wage differences when it comes to gender, but the fact that it's a female dominated industry. But when you start looking at superintendents in those high level 6-figure administrative positions, that's where you start seeing the difference. I think that it's like a 70% are male versus 30% female, again, in a female dominated industry. And so I guess my question to Mr. Farmer is, what are some of the boards doing to start cultivating leadership within and internally so that we're like setting people up for success to apply for those superintendent jobs? And if you have any thoughts on why that discrepancy exists among local boards, I'm just kind of curious to get your thoughts. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you.
Mr. Chairman, I think that is a very interesting piece. And I would say that the number of female superintendents in the state of Wyoming does continue to grow. As a matter of fact, with roughly 10 transitions last year, 4 of those were filled by female district leaders. So I think our numbers are certainly improving. And I think that oftentimes it is the prior leadership experience that matters to a board when making decisions about hiring of superintendents. So looking for folks who have had building leadership experience as well as central office leadership experience. And so many of those females that were hired by Wyoming districts recently had district level administrative experience. So I think part of the way to grow diversity in our leadership is looking at things like curriculum directors, special ed directors, district level leaders, and improving leadership there. That generally leads to leadership at the superintendency.
Representative Conley had her hand up, and then Senator Hicks, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Brian, I'm curious, given your expertise in the hiring of superintendents in the state, that is probably the one job description that is significantly more, we're paying significantly more than what the model says. So I'm curious, how are districts paying for superintendents from your experience? Is it coming straight off of the block grant, or is it coming from reserves or someplace else?
Briefly, if you could, Mr. Farmer, and we're going to break at noon. We might have to come back for Mr. DeCaria.
Mr. Chairman, that is from the block grant.
Okay,
reallocation of resources.
Senator Hicks.
Mr. Chairman, Senator Hicks, you're
Senator Hicks, you're muted.
All right, I'll start again. Thanks for the information, Brian, but when we're making policy decisions that directly impact the fiscal ability of our schools to operate, I need more than just anecdotal stories. And so, anything that you can provide that actually hard data for us to make decisions on, and if you could apply some statistical information associated with that. Again, there may be an uptick of 1 year. Is that a statistical outlier? But at the very least, it would be nice to have trend data like that we've seen the information provided from Dr. Stoddard at the very minimum. Otherwise, it's just anecdotal stories from Michigan. So it's a policy decision, and I need a little bit more information than just stories.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions from members of the committee for Mr. Farmer? Chairman Summers, briefly.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And You know, during this conversation, Superintendent Brown has emailed out some data that comes from one of the professional groups on superintendents. And I think some of that data is good. And so I'm looking at like table 2.1, Brian, and so I'm just maybe as I look at it, it has like the medium salary, minimum salary, median salary in different enrollment districts for superintendents. And so 300 to 999 median salary is 117,500. Is that fairly close to what we're at right now?
Mr. Chairman, is that in reference to the AASA document?
My question, I guess, Mr. Chairman, my question is this document says that enrollment between 300 and 999 enrollment, the median salary is 117,500. Is that comparable or not comparable to what we pay in the model for superintendents? Just let me know that.
Mr. Chairman, I'd be happy to look at data and share that with you, but off the top of my head, that does sound very familiar with the numbers that we see for our smaller districts.
I guess then, Mr. Chairman, just briefly, Dr. Stoddard, my question would go to you. Is that 117,500 line up with our data or what our pay schedule is? What's our pay schedule?
So, Mr. Chairman and Co-Chairman Summers, one comment before I answer that question, which is the data in that comes from survey respondents. And so it looked to me like there were 8 superintendents in Wyoming that responded to that survey. So that gives you a sense of, you know, I'm not super familiar enough to know how representative the people who responded to that survey that was sent out to know if that gives us a good average. But to your point, the model salary for a superintendent, if this answers your question, is $114,000. The actual salary is 141. So that 114 is a little lower than I think the 117 number that you were using from that. But again, that's not a comprehensive survey of all superintendents. That's just who happened to answer that.
No, thank you. I just wanted to get that number. Thanks.
Any other members of the committee? Anything for Mr. Farmer? Seeing none, Mr. DeCaria, let's pick up with you immediately after lunch, if we could, please. It's 12:02. We're scheduled to break at noon for lunch.